Valen, Guardians of Hades romance series, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 7. Ava needed a drink, a stiff one, maybe 2, 3, who knew? She had spent the past few hours locked in her apartment debating what to do, run or fight. As it always would with her, it had come down to fight, but she still wasn't sure who she was going to make her target, Benares or Valen. She parked her black and silver Vespa in a side street, pulled her helmet off and put it into the box beneath the seat as she mulled over her options. Her fingers worked automatically as she took the thick chain and locked the wheel of the scooter, and she sighed as she straightened and stuffed the key into her black jeans. Valen had threatened to kill her if he saw her again. Would he carry out that threat even if she was bringing him information? She wanted to say that he wouldn't, but some part of her knew that he might still go through with it. With her current run of luck, it wouldn't surprise her if he killed her right after she told him everything she knew. Benares viewed him as a weak link. A weak link in what chain, though? She tipped her head back and sighed again at the darkening sky. Going in circles like this was going to get her nowhere. She had to make a decision, and although she feared Valen as much as she feared Benares, she was going to stick with her original plan, whether he killed her or not. She palmed her gun through her leather jacket, the feel of it there if she needed it, soothing her and steadying her nerves. She would have one drink to keep those nerves in check, and then she was going to drive to Valen's apartment and put her plan into action. Hell, maybe she would catch Valen by surprise and gain the upper hand in the situation. A bullet in his thigh might give her that. It would certainly slow him down enough to give her time to make him listen to her. She smiled to herself as she walked along the street, heading towards the small bar she often visited when her thoughts were weighing her down, imagining shooting Valen in the leg and trussing him up while he was preoccupied by the pain. If he was as good at his job as she was, he would find a way out of the ropes or whatever she tied him up with, but she would be long gone by then. Would he come after her or go after Benares? Only time would tell on that one. She scanned the street, checking for the millionth time that she was alone. When Jin had left her, Ava had followed the bitch to the edge of the city, and had only turned back when Jin's car was a speck in the distance on the road to the mansion. Hopefully Benares was keeping his little spy occupied. Ava shuddered at the thought. Even if he had another tail on her, all they would see was her doing as he had bid, finding Valen and taking another shot at him. Not that she was going to seduce him. She would do her best to make it look as if she was, though, just in case someone was watching her. The guy standing guard outside the bar nodded as she approached and pulled the metal door open for her. She thanked him with a smile and a sway of her hips, enough to appease his appetite, and didn't punch him in the face when he smacked her on the arse as she passed him. Her smile dropped off her face, a scowl taking its place as she walked up the concrete stairs, the blue overhead lights hurting her tired eyes and making it hard to see ahead of her. She hated that. It always felt as if she was walking into a trap. As an assassin, she relied heavily on all of her senses, and having one dampened always set her on edge. The light gave way as she reached the top of the steps and left the corridor behind, allowing her to scan the room for any potential threats. She swept the room from right to left, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Ava froze as her gaze hit a booth on the left of the room. She recovered an instant later before his eyes landed on her, and casually strolled towards the bar, pretending she hadn't seen him. Valen. His gaze tracked her, burned into her despite the distance between them, but she shut him out as her heart pounded hard against her chest, and the nerve she had come here to quash rose to new heights, making her limbs stiff. She eased into a stool at the bar as smoothly as she could manage and secretly blew out her breath as his eyes left her. Ava flagged the bartender, getting the guy. He smiled at her and she shot him one back, because it didn't hurt to flirt. She glanced at Valen while the man took her order for a shot of vodka, especially when he was with a woman. A very beautiful woman. His lover? Deep red hair curled around her slender shoulders, brushed the black strapless dress she wore, and seemed to glow against her pale skin. Warmth washed over her soft, delicate features as she spoke, an undeniable air of grace surrounding her, making her appear almost too perfect to be real. She looked like a damn fae, something from another world, a goddess. She was certainly holding Valen's attention. He was staring at the woman with heat and tenderness in his golden eyes, a look she had never witnessed in them before, one that said he was close to the woman. They were around the same age, and she was stunning, even more beautiful than Jin. She had to be his lover. No man in his right mind could be with a woman that beautiful and not want her. Ava downed her shot and ordered another, trying to keep her eyes off Valen and his female friend, because the way he was looking at her and she at him was stirring all kinds of feelings inside Ava, ones she didn't want to examine too closely. She didn't care if he had a girlfriend, if he loved someone. Last night meant nothing to her. She swallowed the second shot of vodka, and the bartender poured her another and leaned his left elbow on the bar. His muscles bunched, causing his white shirt to tighten across them, and she tried to listen as he talked to her, the sparkle in his dark eyes saying he was flirting with her. She managed a few responses, even touched his arm, causing him to suddenly look there. Valen's gaze burned into her. She shut him out, laughed at something the bartender had said. The feel of Valen's eyes on her grew more intense, heating her and making her heart pound, filling her head with images of last night, and how fiercely he had kissed her, and how rough and possessive he had been with her, and the things he had said. He could have died right then and wouldn't have cared. She drew her hand away from the bartender's arm and nursed her vodka shot. It had been the drug speaking. He felt nothing for her. He meant nothing to her. A little voice taunted her, whispering that if he meant nothing, why was she drowning her sorrows while thinking about him? Why was she jealous of the woman he was talking to again now, his eyes bright and flooded with warmth, the complete opposite to the way he had looked at her? She downed the third vodka, hoping to kill the brain cells that were fixated on him. Glanced at Valen. The warmth in his eyes was gone. Darkness crossed his face as he stared at the table that separated him and the woman, and then he lifted his gaze to hers. Pain. It was there in his eyes, written in every handsome line of his face. The woman said something. He shook his head and bowed it, shoving his fingers into the longer lengths of his blonde hair and clawed it back. The muscle in his jaw popped, and he plowed his fingers through the shorter hair around the sides of his head. His shoulders sagged and his eyes closed. What had the woman said to him? Whatever it had been, it had hurt him. Ava tried to drag her eyes away, guilt crawling through her. The conversation was clearly intimate, and she was invading their privacy. She had just found the strength to look away when the woman reached over the table and touched his left cheek, feathering her fingers over the scar there and then down his neck, unafraid to touch it. Valen raised his head and looked at her through eyes that held an incredible depth of love. Ava looked away from him, her chest tight and aching, and focused on her drink instead. The bartender had kindly filled it for her again. She turned the small glass back and forth in her fingers, telling herself on repeat to leave. Being here was only hurting her. She needed to speak with him, though. He hadn't killed her yet, so there was a chance if she approached him now and told him everything, he would take the bait and she would live to see another day. She glanced back at them. The woman covered Valen's hand with her own and held it. His expression didn't change, the emotion that had flooded it remaining even as she spoke to him and he responded. An emotion that surprised Ava. Vulnerability. It was the final straw. Everything she thought she knew about him turned on its head, and she saw him in a different light. He had proven himself a killer, someone without a shred of emotion. She had spent hours following him, and not once had he shown any hint of softness. Everything about him had been hard and cold, his emotions locked down in a way that she had envied. And then last night it happened. At the time, she had been convinced that the passion and need, the desire and tenderness he had revealed to her had been a reaction to the drug, just as her behavior had been. Now, she knew it had been real. He wasn't a man without feeling. He wasn't a merciless and cold killer. He was something else. She didn't fully understand him yet, but she wanted to know him. She wanted to know this side of him so she could complete the picture of him. Impossible. He had made that clear to her this morning when he had thrown her out of his apartment. If she went to him, the walls would come up, the emotions locked down again, held beyond her reach. She couldn't blame him. If last night had been real, then she had wounded him by denying remembering it. He struck her as the sort of man who reacted viciously when wounded, would do anything to protect himself from further hurt, and didn't forgive easily. Ava frowned as the woman stood and wished she could hear what she was saying to Valen, because the way he tipped his head back and looked at her made Ava's heart break for him. Thumping music made it impossible to hear their conversation, though, leaving her with only his reaction. The woman bent over and he closed his eyes as she embraced him, her slender arms wrapped around his shoulders and her lips pressing against his forehead. When she pulled back, he opened his eyes again, locking them straight on hers. The woman swept the long strands of his hair from his forehead, the action tender and filled with love, and said something, an anxious edge to her expression. He nodded and the woman left. Ava watched her go, waiting until she had disappeared into the crowd gathering on the dance floor before turning her focus back to Valen. He stared at the table in front of him. No, he was staring at the woman's empty glass, a distant look in his eyes, one laced with hurt. She blew out her breath. This was going to end badly. She flagged the bartender. 2 shots. His right eyebrow shot up, and then he frowned across the room at Valen, muttered something, and went to work. He slammed a second glass down beside her one, filled them both, and didn't wait to take her money. He walked away from her. She thought about calling him back, and then shrugged it off and picked up the 2 glasses. What did she care if a man was in a mood with her because he thought she was interested in someone else? She was probably going to be dead in the next 5 seconds anyway. Ava pushed out of her stool, dragged in another deep breath to steady herself, and marched to her doom. Valen tensed when she slammed the glass down on the table in front of him, arched an eyebrow, and then glared up at her. "You look as though your girlfriend has just dumped you." She shot for cocky as she flicked her hair out of her face and stood a little taller, hoping he couldn't see through the mask she wore to the truth lurking beneath. He scared her a little. Just a little. He had threatened to kill her after all. Cold golden eyes narrowed on her, empty of the tender emotion she had seen in them just minutes ago. "I thought I told you never to come near me again." He pushed the drink away, leaned back into the black leather seat of the booth, and folded his arms across his chest, causing his defined muscles to flex. Ava ignored the hot bolt of desire that blasted through her and casually took the seat opposite him, doing the opposite to everything her instincts were screaming. She was not going to run. She slid the drink back across the circular table to him. "If you want, I'll kill your woman for free." He scowled at her. "My woman?" She jerked her head towards the door behind her. "The one that was just here." His golden eyes shifted to it. "My mother." He had to be joking. "Leave." His expression changed abruptly, darkening around 20 degrees, and he pushed the drink back at her again. "Last warning." Ava wished he would look at her with the same consuming fire that had been in his eyes when he had stared at the woman. There was only ice in them, as thick and impenetrable as a glacier. As much as she was beginning to want to leave, she couldn't. Not until she had done what she had come here to do. "The people visited me." His face lost some of the darkness at least, gaining a glimmer of curiosity. It lasted all of a second before the veil descended again. He picked up the shot glass and glared through the clear liquid at her. "So it's poison, then?" Ava glared right back at him. "Poison isn't my style." He laughed, a mirthless and dark sound. Fine. She had drugged him, and at the time she had been convinced it had been poison in the darts and in the syringe. "It's their style. I do what the client wants." She wasn't sure why she felt the need to defend herself with him. Did she want him to approve of her? Would he think less of her if she was the sort of assassin that employed poison as a tool, rather than choosing a more intimate method of dispatching their marks? She remembered how confident he had been with only a blade, that all the time she had seen him fight, he had only ever used a knife, never a gun, never a drug. He sniffed the shot glass, looked as if he might drink it, and then held it away from his lips again. "It's just booze. I thought you needed it. You looked as though you were breaking up." He slammed the glass down with a sharp bang. "She's my mother." A few patrons looked her way, and she smiled at them all, hoping they would go back to dancing and drinking, leaving them alone again. Was he serious? "Leave," he bit out, and shoved the shot glass towards her, spilling more of the contents. "Final warning." He was fond of issuing those, but he didn't seem inclined to act on them, at least not with her. Ava might have obeyed him this time, but when he had shouted at her, he had revealed something about him that she had never noticed before, and she felt pretty damn sure she should have, given the fact that tongue had been in her mouth, rasping over her flesh just a few hours ago. There was a stud in it, a plain metal ball right in the center of the tip. How the hell had she missed that during their little makeout session? Her pulse pounded in response, and she wrestled with the sudden flush of desire that rushed through her, somehow managing to get a lid on it and remain in control. There was something terribly sexy about it, something wicked and alluring that tugged at her and made her want to crawl onto the table and kiss him, but at the same time it rang warning bells in her head. Was he a player? It was the sort of thing such a man would have. Plus, he had looked very close to the woman who had just left, yet he hadn't turned Ava down last night when she had been all over him. She wasn't buying his line that the woman was his mother. His golden eyes burned into her. Maybe it was his stepmother? "She's really your mother?" She had to ask because it was beginning to get weird. First, Jin talking about Benares being her brother, even though the bitch clearly had a thing for him. Now Valen was speaking about a woman he had looked more like a lover to than a son, being his mother. He sighed, and she had never had a man sigh at her in a way that clearly screamed he wanted to reach over the table and choke her with his bare hands. "She's my mother," he gritted out, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "She doesn't come to see me often, only when she can leave home. Dad misses her too much, so she never stays away long. Not like the old days when she would spend the whole of summer in Greece." His eyes snapped to her, so fierce and sharp that she tensed. "Why the fuck am I telling you this anyway?" She wasn't sure, but she wasn't going to do anything to make him stop. She had followed this man for months and never uncovered any personal information about him. Now he was telling her about his family, although she still found it hard to believe that the woman who had just been sitting with him was his mother. Even if she was his stepmother, she still looked too young to have been spending summers in Greece away from his father. Valen had made it sound as if he was talking about a time decades ago, and the woman had looked around the same age as him, barely into her 30s. No way that woman could have been married to his father back then. "Unwind. Have a drink." Because she was beginning to need one of her own. She lifted the shot glass to her lips, and awareness of his eyes on her, tracking her every move, had her slowing down, savoring the way he followed her hand and the way his gaze drilled into her mouth. His golden eyes darkened, something shimmering in them, heat that had been there the night he had fought her in front of the Pantheon, and had shown in them again last night when he had been fighting to resist her. God, he had fought it. She had given in to the haze of lust so easily, but he had tried to be a gentleman. It hit her hard, and she knocked the drink back, needing it now more than ever. He muttered something she thought might have been temptress and looked away from her. Ava pushed his drink back towards him. He frowned down at it. "You drink it." He tried to push it back, but she kept hold of the glass, refusing to let him do it. His fingers slipped on the glass and touched hers, and she gasped as lightning arced up her arm, heating her bones and setting her body on fire. He snatched his hand back. Had he felt that? "I don't drink." If he had felt it, he masked it well, hiding it better than she had. She had felt sparks for a man before, back in her youth, Or at least she had thought she had. What she had experienced with that man, it was nothing compared with how Valen could light her up with nothing more than a brief brush of his fingers across hers. It was nothing compared with how he could set her on fire with just a look. His golden eyes met hers, igniting an inferno in her veins as they held hers, steady and unwavering, dark with desire that called to her own, giving it a stronger hold over her. "Drink it," she murmured, not quite with the world as she lost herself in his eyes. He shook his head. "No." "If you drink it, I'll tell you all about my clients. Everything I know." It had been the plan all along to tell him everything she knew, but suddenly it felt like a desperate move on her part, born not of a desire to unleash him on Benares so she would be free, and more of a desire to make Valen stay, to make him talk to her. That wasn't like her at all. What the hell was wrong with her? What was it about him that had her going against every instinct she had as an assassin? "If you drink it, I'll tell you what they told me." His eyes darted between hers and the glass, turning hard and cold one second and filled with conflict the next, as if she was asking him to do something terrible. "I can't." There was more emphasis on it this time. "There will be repercussions if I do." Repercussions? It was only a drink. "Your loss." Ava took the glass. He grabbed her hand, sending another 1,000 volts screaming up her arm. His fingers were warm against her, that heat oddly comforting, rousing a fiercer need to make him stay. He held her firm, and she lifted her eyes from his hand to his face. He stared into her eyes with such force, such intensity, that it shook her, and his voice was such a low whisper laced with something akin to fear or possibly even remorse. "If I drink this, I don't know what will happen." Ava smiled. "I'll give you information. That's what will happen. Live dangerously." He grinned and her heart stuttered. "Always do." Chapter 8. "If I drink this, I don't know what will happen." Honest words, ones that would chill a lesser man to his bones, especially if they knew what he did, that the unknown reaction to the drink his little angel offered could be anything from a mild buzz to the complete annihilation of Rome. That little angel smiled like the devil she really was, always leading him into temptation. "I'll give you information. That's what will happen. Live dangerously." He grinned. "Always do." And wasn't that the crux of his problem? Sense waged war with a deeply rooted need that he had never been able to kill, no matter how fiercely he had tried. A need to please his brothers and redeem himself. A need that drove him to do stupid things that would probably only end with them hating him even more than they already did. If that was possible, he was about to find out. Valen closed his eyes and necked the drink. It went down hot, burning his throat, and he could feel it spreading tendrils through his body, fiery fingers that worked their way outwards from his heart until they gripped every inch of him. A tremble started in the pit of his stomach, vibrations that rumbled through his bones, and he gripped the table in front of him with both hands, desperate to anchor himself. Light exploded in its wake, blasting through him and filling all of him, blinding him to the darkness that rose up behind it, a shadow of doom. He sank short claws into the wooden tabletop and growled through his gritted teeth as hunger poured through him, a ferocious need that pounded in his blood and mastered him, rending holes in his strength until it leached from him, and he swore he could see it pouring from his flesh like blood. Valen tried to scoop it up, desperately pressed his hands to his chest and stomach, fighting the hold of the hunger. Black shadows flowed from between his fingers, swirled and disappeared into the light, and nothing he did stopped them from leaving him. The light around him faded, and he stilled as he faced the shadow that loomed before him, a flickering silhouette of destruction and damnation. Horns rose from its head like a crown, and talons tipped the fingers of the hand it extended to him, mirroring his own movements as he reached for it. Crimson eyes glowed from the black abyss of its face, edged with gold, blazing in the darkness as it called him to surrender to it. Give up the fight. Give in. Valen pressed his palm against the shadow's outstretched one and surrendered to it. Chapter 9. Ava reached for Valen as he shook before her, gripping the edge of the table with such force that it rattled between them. What was wrong with him? His eyes snapped open before she could touch him, and she gasped as they glowed in the low light, liquid pools of fire, golden and shifting like an inferno. A dark shadow crossed his face, and his wide pupils narrowed into pinpricks. Tiny sparks skittered over his bare arms. The shot glasses on the table smashed. Ava gasped. "What are you?" Her voice shook as violently as the rest of her as she shrank back into the seat, mind racing and heart pounding, both sending her spinning as she tried to grasp what she had just seen. A memory hit her. How she had traveled from the square on Tiber Island to Valen's apartment, in the blink of an eye. His glowing golden eyes narrowed on her. The stuff of dreams and nightmares. He locked his hand around her wrist before she could take that in, and hauled her out of her seat. She stumbled along behind him, struggling to catch up and comprehend what was happening. He dragged her into the middle of the busy dance floor and whipped her into his arms. Lightning rushed through her again as his hard body met hers, and his hands claimed her waist, one sliding low to cup her backside. She trembled in his arms, thoughts pulling her in 1,000 directions, all of them screaming at her to get away from him. Those thoughts fled as he began to move, starting a slow, sensual dance that worked his body against hers, filling her head with wicked images of them. She tried to hold it together, to retain some sense so she could figure out what was happening, but it became impossible when he went to war on her, lowering his head and kissing her neck. A hot shiver danced down her throat to her breasts as his tongue stroked a line up her neck, and she felt the cool, hard beat of his tongue stud pressing into her flesh. She had to stop this. She wasn't sure what was happening, didn't understand why her mind was screaming this was a bad thing, that she had made a dreadful mistake by convincing him to drink that shot of vodka. But she had never ignored her instincts before, and she wouldn't start now, no matter how tempted she was to surrender to him. Ava tried to push him back, but his right hand clamped down on her backside and hauled her back against him, and his left hand wrapped around her throat. He pressed his thumb against her jaw and tilted her head back, devoured her throat with hot, wet kisses that worked to undo the strength she had found, making it bleed out of her, and replacing it with an aching need to give in to him. She wanted to give in. She wanted that passion they had shared last night, that madness. He groaned against her skin and worked his hands into her leather jacket as he danced with her, a slow grind that was at odds with the pounding fast beat of the music. His body rolled against hers, all hard muscle and strength, power that had her knees weakening and body straining for more. She lost the fight against the desire he stirred in her when he skimmed his hands across her stomach and they met her guns, and he moaned low in his throat, shuddered in her arms, as if finding her armed had thrilled him. God. Ava swallowed hard, closed her eyes, and desperately tried to muster the will to resist, the strength to break away from him and do what was right, getting him back to the booth and talking to him. His mouth seized hers, hot, hard, demanding, intoxicating. Ava melted into his arms as he wrapped them around her, pinning her to his chest and bending her backwards, bending her to his will. She moaned into his mouth as his tongue brushed hers, unable to hold it back. He groaned in response, as if he had heard the quiet sound of supplication over the thumping music, and it pleased him. He kissed her harder, mastering her as he had the night before, and she was powerless in his arms. He shuddered when she stroked his lower lip with her tongue, and his mouth froze against hers, a sense that he was waiting for something filling her. She smiled as it hit her and licked his lower lip again, and then sucked it into her mouth, pressed her teeth into it and tugged hard on it, surrendering to the same wicked need that had rolled through her the last time she had been in his arms. Valen growled and claimed her mouth again, plundering it with his tongue, the stud clacking against her teeth. She wanted to feel that stud on her flesh again, imagined the places he could use it, and trembled against him as a new hot wave of desire flashed through her. He moaned and kissed along her jaw, nipping it hard in places, sending sharp bolts of pain down her neck to mingle with the pleasure building within her. He wrapped his lips around her neck and sucked, ripping a husky groan from her throat as she clutched his head. A few people stopped to look at her, but she shot them all glares and they went back to dancing. Sense reared its head again, whispered that she had to stop this now before it went any further. It seemed Valen didn't possess the same niggling voice. His palm met her crotch, and she shuddered as he rubbed her through her jeans, teasing her and winding her tighter, until she was fit to burst or scream. His mouth worked magic on her throat, his left hand seizing the nape of her neck and sending shivers tripping down her back and chest. Her nipples tightened, aching for his attention even though she was aware of their location, of the people surrounding them. Valen's right hand grabbed her backside, and he wedged his right thigh between hers, and she bit back a moan as it pressed against her core, rubbing it with each sway of their bodies, sending her spiraling closer to the edge. She needed him to kiss her again. Ava tunneled her fingers into the longer lengths of his golden hair and yanked his head back. The look on his face stopped her dead. Golden eyes held hers, a glimmer of affection shining in them, directed at her this time. She loosened her hold on his hair and fell into those eyes, her awareness of the world around them fading as he looked down at her, hiding nothing from her now. She lowered her hand to his face, wanting to touch it as the woman had, to show him that she wasn't afraid of him either. Someone touched her shoulder. His eyes turned jet black and snapped up to lock on the person behind her. She gasped as he disappeared. A muffled grunt and feminine shriek and a low growl had her whipping around on her heel, in time to see Valen send a brunette man to his backside in the middle of the packed dance floor. Her eyes shot wide. The woman who had screamed ran. The man stared in disbelief at Valen, blood streaming from his nose. As for Valen, he let out another inhuman growl, his shoulders shifting with each hard breath he drew. They were shaking. Ava eased a step closer to him, drawn towards him by an urge to comfort him that she didn't quite understand. Was it because she wanted him to know that she had no interest in the man he had punched, or because of something else? The way he had looked in the moment before he had disappeared flashed across her eyes. So much darkness, so much fury. She leaped back when he suddenly bellowed and clutched his head, bending forwards as he yelled at the floor. The dance floor broke into pandemonium, people pushing for the exit while others scrambled back toward the tables, heading for friends or their belongings. "Valen?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached for him, her instincts blaring a warning at her that she refused to heed. He wasn't going to hurt her. She hoped. The man with the broken nose spoke as he pulled himself onto his feet, muttering it beneath his breath, but the music ended abruptly just as he said it, the DJ deciding it was time to join everyone else in trying to get away from the fight. "Woman, that heart is wasted on you. I just wanted to see if she would trade up." Ava wanted to hit him herself for that one. Valen beat her to it. With a feral growl, he launched himself at the man, tackling him back to the ground. The entire room froze as they went at it, exchanging punches as they rolled around, kicking at each other. She didn't like the man's odds. Valen landed twice as many blows as they brawled, and the man was clumsy in his attacks, obviously untrained. She needed to do something or he was going to end up dead. She grabbed Valen's arm when he went to swing another punch at his foe. He froze and slowly turned his head towards her, his golden eyes turning darker than black as he looked at her hand where it gripped his arm, stopping him from hitting the man. Ava realized her mistake around a second before he shoved to his feet, grabbed the man by his throat, and threw him across the room as if he weighed nothing. She had defended the man. "It isn't what you—" Valen shoved her aside, and she grunted as she hit the black bar, pain shooting outwards from her back. She bent forwards and gritted her teeth, eyes watering as she struggled to shut down the pain and push it out of her body. The sound of glass smashing, the cries of women, and pained groans and muffled grunts of a fight surrounded her, blending in her ears into one cacophony, She had been in bar fights before. Ava lifted her head and looked around her. But none of them had been like this. None of the fighters had been like him. Valen didn't even flinch as several men attacked him, striking him with broken glass bottles and chair legs, trying to beat him down. He fought back against them all, never surrendering even an inch of ground to them, taking each blow he couldn't block and still managing to land some of his own. Another man flew across the room to land at her feet, his face a bloodied mess as he wheezed. She looked from him to Valen, her eyes going wide again as he slammed his fist into a table one opponent shoved at him, and the thick wood shattered as though it was made of flimsy tinder. A man came around behind him and Valen spun on his heel, and she gasped as she saw the state of him. Lacerations covered his chest, long rips in his black t-shirt exposing them to her eyes, and a thick gash darted up the right side of his neck and over his jaw, the cut deep and bleeding heavily. The fear that had been gripping her disappeared, blasted away by the sight of him. She had to stop him before he got himself killed. Ava shoved away from the bar and collapsed to her knees, shock rocking her as 5 tall men appeared around Valen, and a 6th just poofed out of nowhere a few meters away, this one bringing a woman with him. What the ever-living fuck? She stared slack-jawed as the 5 men worked to contain Valen, unable to compute what she had just witnessed, even when it backed up what had dawned on her when her memories of last night had completed themselves. People could teleport. Valen snarled and growled like a wild thing, fighting the men as they tried to overpower him, and an urge rushed through her, commanding her to rise onto her feet and help him. These men all outmuscled and outweighed her, but she was damned if she was going to stand by and let them treat him so roughly when he was hurt. She shoved onto her feet. Someone grabbed her arm and held her back, their grip fierce and unrelenting. "Do not interfere." A man. She looked up at him and found kind dark eyes watching her, and a rough yet handsome face warmed by a smile that seemed out of place in the current situation. Unruly dark waves caressed his forehead and curled against his neck, brushing sun-kissed skin. "Valen just needs to calm down." They knew him then. "Dial it back, brother," the one with long blonde hair said and held his hands out in front of him, palms facing Valen as Valen turned on him with a snarl. A white-haired man eased around behind Valen, and one with overlong black hair that was similar to Valen's in style, but hung over the left side of his face and had been shaved neatly around the sides, not hacked, moved in from the other side. They were flanking him. His eyes darted between them all, shifting to whoever had moved last, but kept returning to the one nearest to her. A tall man with a physique that matched Valen's, wild short black hair and sideburns that reached low on his cheeks and came down at an angle, tapering to a point that accented his sculpted cheekbones. A long black coat hugged his slender frame, flaring from his waist to almost brush the heels of his polished black shoes. Valen's eyes narrowed on him, and his right hand went to the thin black braid around his left wrist. All 6 men tensed. "I would not do that, little brother." The tall black-haired man's smooth voice held a note of warning, a thinly veiled threat that things would get bloody if Valen disobeyed him. Valen pulled on the band. The man disappeared into a swirl of black smoke and reappeared behind Valen, his left hand landing on Valen's shoulder, and his right hand catching Valen's to stop him from snapping the band. "You need to sleep it off," the man said. Valen's face twisted in disgust. He collapsed. The man caught him and gently lowered him to the floor, the same floor that felt as if it was pitching and rolling now, unstable beneath her trembling legs. She struggled for air, sucked down breath after breath that did nothing to stop her head from spinning. What the fuck was happening? Who the hell were these people? Who the hell was Valen? His words rang in her twirling mind. The stuff of dreams and nightmares. Her legs gave out. The man's hand on her arm stopped her from hitting the floor. He pulled her back onto her feet and shifted his grip to hold her upright. The black-haired man looked from Valen to her, the concern that had been filling his green eyes disappearing in a heartbeat, turning them as cold and hard as emeralds. "How long can you hold them, Karis?" the white-haired one said to him, and something dawned on her. The other people weren't moving. She stared at everyone else in the bar, cold crawling over her skin beneath her clothes, fear that trickled into her blood and turned it to icy sludge. Everything was frozen in place. Not just the people as they stood like statues, some running for the exit while others reached for objects they could use as weapons. Those objects, too. A broken bottle hung suspended in the air just behind the white-haired one, levitating there. God, she was losing her mind. The one the man had called Karis pinched the bridge of his nose and frowned. I do not know. Long enough, I hope. Long enough for what? Get to work, Karis barked, and they all burst into action, moving between the frozen people and pressing 2 fingers to each of their temples. Even her guard left her. Ava eyed Valen where he laid on the floor in the middle of the room, blood trickling from his wounds, torn between going to him and running like hell. She didn't want to leave him with these men, but if they were his brothers, they would take care of him. There had been concern in Karis's eyes when he had been looking at Valen. She had to believe that he wasn't going to hurt him. She had to because if she stayed here, she was 99% certain she was going to pass out just like Valen had, but without any assistance from his magical God-only-knew-what brother. Ava sidestepped. Karis's green eyes snapped to her. Damn. He stalked towards her, his long black coat flaring around his ankles in a way that looked unnatural, eerie. She backed away and hit the bar, trapped. Do you have any idea how difficult it will be to remedy this? He snapped, and something flashed in his green eyes, something that reminded her of how Valen had looked before he had turned into a raging, savage, and dangerous beast, bent on destroying everything and everyone in the bar. No. The darkness in Karis went far beyond what she had seen in Valen's eyes. Tone, someone muttered. It might have been the brunette who had appeared with the woman. Karis scowled in his direction anyway. When he looked back at her, the darkness in his eyes was gone, and it struck her that he was as stupidly handsome as Benares. Probably just as dangerous, too. What gene pool had they crawled out of? She looked past him to Valen, and her heart kicked up a notch, beating harder against her ribs. Blood had pooled in the cuts on his face and formed a line across his cheek from the left corner of his mouth. But even with all the bruises and blood and the scar, he was still more handsome to her than Karis or Benares. He made her heart pound. Karis cleared his throat, and her gaze zipped back to him. What happened? He said, his tone softer now, and she was sure the one who had muttered before about his tone praised him for it. I told him to have a drink and unwind. I didn't know. Fuck, someone cut her off. Fuck indeed, another replied. The built-like-a-bodybuilder brunette with the woman grimaced. We're in trouble now. He did make a mess. She felt small when they all turned to glare at her and shrank back against the bar. It is not the mess. This time it was the one who had held her arm. He seemed far nicer than the others, that smile still in place, warming his rough features. He had the build of the other brunette, but he wasn't wearing a coat like that man and the others. A pale linen shirt hugged his broad chest, hanging loose over a pair of dark linen trousers, and his toes poked out the end of his sandals. We are not allowed to drink alcohol. Karis. He looked as if he meant it, too, which caused a cold feeling in the pit of her stomach. He knew better. He always knows better. Never stops him, though, does it? The white-haired one again, and the look he threw at Valen made her want to scream at him that she had made him do it. Valen had told her how many times that he couldn't drink it. She had practically forced it down his throat. The look on all their faces said that they had made up their mind, though. They thought Valen had done it on purpose. He had, but not to get any of them or himself into trouble. He had done it for information. The blond man who looked the youngest of the group at barely 30, and the one with black hair styled similar to Valen's, picked him up off the floor, holding him between them. Karis turned his back on her and looked at the other 3 men. Make it quick. What are you going to do? Ava lunged forwards, afraid they were going to hurt Valen. She ran straight into Karis's arm and grunted as it slammed hard against her chest, knocking the wind from her. He turned glacial green eyes on her. Memory alteration. The way he said that, his voice dark and cold, devoid of any emotion, sent a shudder through her and had her easing back a step and looking for the nearest exit. She had seen enough strange things in the past 24 hours to believe these men were capable of such a thing. He stared down into her eyes and slowly shifted to face her, and the ice in her veins grew thicker. The frozen people in the club weren't the only ones about to get their brains meddled with. She swallowed hard. He was going to mess with hers, too. Ava blurted the first thing that came to her. "I have valuable information." The bodybuilder stopped halfway through saying something to the petite brunette he had brought with him and looked across at Karis. "She the girl?" "The girl." "It would seem so." Karis ran a glance over her and then looked back at Valen where he hung between the two men. "What have you gotten yourself into now?" Will he be okay?" Her voice was small, but it seemed loud in the silent room. Everyone stared at her, shock written across their faces this time. Even the kind brunette looked surprised. "As far as we know, you have tried to kill our brother several times," Karis snapped, his eyes flashing dangerously as he closed in on her. "Why the hell do you care if he will be all right?" She didn't have an answer to that. "I shouldn't, right?" She wasn't sure why she was tossing that question out there, as if they could tell her at what point she had lost her mind and gone completely off the rails, undoing years of self-discipline and training, and tossing all of her instincts as an assassin aside. She looked back at Valen, her chest warming at the sight of him, even as fear for him flooded her veins. "But I do." The 6 men all exchanged a look. "What are you going to do to him?" She bravely met Karis's cold eyes. She wasn't sure she could take him in a fight. Something about him warned her not to even try, but the rest of her was ignoring it and gearing up for one, her mind sharpening and instincts firing as she secretly assessed everyone in the room, trying to discern their weaknesses. "You should be more concerned about what we might do to you." Her gun was in her hand in a flash, and she had it aimed at him before he could react. When he did react, it was nothing more than a slight quirk of his right eyebrow. Not quite what she had expected. Someone chuckled. "She has fight. I like her," the woman said, and received a round of chastising looks from the men. The big brunette slung his arm around her shoulders and tugged her against him. "You would. She takes after you. Waving a gun in my brother's face to protect one of us." Ava was tempted to look at the woman and see whether she had done just that, but kept her eyes locked on Karis. His face remained impassive, and her nerves started to crumble as he just stood there and stared at her, as if waiting for her to make her move. "You're not going to hurt him." She pulled the hammer back. Karis took her statement as a question. "Of course not. As annoying as he can be, he is our brother. Why in our father's good and gracious name would we hurt him?" He shook his head and turned away from her. Ava frowned at the back of his head. Wait, she did have a gun, didn't she? Yes, there it was in her hand, aimed at him, ready to fire. Why the hell wasn't he reacting? Why was he acting as if she posed no threat to him at all? "You're not going to hurt me either, Stronzo." She squeezed the trigger. He disappeared. She gasped as a hand materialized out of thin air and knocked the gun up just as it fired, sending the bullet blasting into the ceiling, and another hand grasped her throat, fingers pressing into it and sending pain radiating through her bones. Those fingers shifted, closing over her jaw, and Karis pulled her head down as his lips found her right ear. "See him," he whispered into it, his voice a dark, menacing snarl that sent a cold shiver down her spine as she looked at Valen. "He is the only reason you are still alive, not the information you have in this head I could pick apart in seconds, or that pathetic weapon in your hand. Him." "Why?" That question trembled on her lips. "Because something tells me alcohol is not the reason he just tried to destroy this bar." The black-haired one holding Valen's arm scowled at her, his blue eyes eerily bright in the low light. The blonde one on the other side of Valen looked across at him. "Let's take him home, Escher. Everything is good here." They disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. Ava stood frozen to the spot, fear like acid in her veins, her hand shaking hard against the gun. Karis whispered into her ear, his words the most sinister and terrifying thing she had ever heard in all her years as an assassin. "You have a lot of explaining to do." She read between the lines to the threat hidden within. If he didn't like what she had to say, she was a dead woman. Chapter 10. Green splashed across his vision, black intersected it, gold made it shine, crimson stained it. Twin orbs of that dreadful scarlet hovered before him, trembling against the hazy backdrop of emerald, obsidian, and sunshine. Light that had left his world, but wasn't destined for the next. Cold stole through him, numbing his flesh, chilling his bones. It took everything from him at first, washing it all away, leaving nothing. Nothing. Crimson. It wavered before his eyes, out of focus, suspended above the dying light. A light that had left his world, plunged it into darkness. Fire began in the hollow pit of his chest, born of the fragile emotions piecing themselves back together, piecing him back together, but in a new way. The male they constructed from the scattered remnants her departure had left behind knew nothing of the light. He embraced the dark, the violence, and the fury, the desperate need for vengeance. They had taken her from him. They had failed. The scarlet orbs grew smaller, seemed to burn brighter, gold streaks swirling around them now. The scattered pieces gathered faster, racing to finish their dark work. The god they constructed had no light, no love, not a single drop left for this world or those in it. Because this world had taken everything from him. It had taken her. It had failed him. The green, black, and fading gold dropped away, and darkness swallowed it, leaving only the burning crimson and the harsh, swift arcs of lightning that chased around them. They would pay. White burst into life around him, chasing back the darkness. But it wasn't light. It wasn't her. She was gone. He blinked slowly as he pivoted on his heel, and everything came into focus. The white, glistening marble columns that enclosed him in a circle, the dazzling green fields that surrounded it, the endless blue sky. All things she would never see again. The dais in front of him, the three females huddled there, the blood on his hands. Her blood. Soon it would be theirs, because they had failed her. Darkness poured through him, oily and thick, consuming all of him and driving out the last of the light. There would be only darkness on this day, only death. The youngest female crawled forwards, fear written in her blue eyes as she reached a hand out to him, the white robe she wore pooling around her, cinched with gold at her waist. Gold. He despised that color now. It no longer had the luster or brought the light he had once enjoyed. Now it was the color of death. "Please," she whispered, hoarse and broken, weak. They never should have been allowed to protect her. Their favor meant nothing. He turned his gaze away from her and shut out her cries for mercy, her pathetic whimpers, and stared off into the distance, to the point where green fields met blue skies. She should have been somewhere like this. She should have been allowed to go to the Blessed Isles. She should have been allowed to live. "You decided your fate when you decided hers." He flicked his hand towards Clotho, and her scream rang in his ears, echoed around the mountain, and sent deep pleasure rolling down his spine. The sharp tang of his power filled the air, charged it as he unleashed it all on her. A swift death. The other two wouldn't be as lucky. His mercy had just run dry. Lachesis made the mistake of trying to escape. He was on her in a heartbeat, driving her into the ground and tearing at her with claws he didn't recognize. Mind pounding with a dark urge that controlled him, stole away any command of his body, refusing to release him until it was satisfied. Crimson splashed across white and gold, his vision turning hazy as he slashed at her flesh. She had to pay. Her struggle ceased, and he canted his head and frowned down at her, confused. He shook her, growled as he realized she was dead, and turned to face the remaining fate. She stood in the middle of the temple, robes fluttering in the breeze that tousled her snow-white hair. Worn, creased hands folded gently in front of her, and her dim gray eyes held his, showing no fear, only acceptance. "Valen," she murmured, her voice thin and reedy. "It was not our doing." He knew that, but someone had to pay. He rose to his feet and came to face her. Crimson rolled down the hard plates of his chest piece, soaking into the black leather and tainting the gold trim. The leather of his right vambrace creaked as he moved his arm and closed his fingers over the hilt of the sword hanging from his left hip. The sound of metal sliding against metal broke the silence as he drew the blade, felt the weight of it in his grip, and it was the weight of his responsibility, a heavy burden to bear, but one he would shoulder nonetheless. For her. His eyes stung, vision blurring again, and he blinked, frowned as twin streaks of heat formed on his cheeks, and realized that it hadn't been rage blinding him when he had sat with her lifeless body, or when he had killed Lachesis. It had been tears. He rubbed the back of his left hand across his face, not caring when the black leather plates that protected the back of it caught his nose and hurt, because nothing could eclipse the pain that now lived in his heart. Eternal. He flexed his fingers around the hilt of the sword, felt it vibrate with his power as it became part of him, and stormed towards the remaining fate. Atropos bowed her head and held her arms out to him. He roared, unleashing all the pain and fury inside him, stepped and appeared right in front of her. Her cloudy eyes widened. Her lips parted on a shocked gasp. Valen caught her as she slumped and gently laid her down in the middle of the temple, numbness rushing in to dull the fierce pain and his anger, leaving him hollow inside. "He will not allow this," she whispered. He bowed his head, his golden hair sweeping forwards to brush his cheeks. The mark on the left side of his face and neck burned, as if warning him that the one she spoke of was already aware of what he had done. "I know," he murmured, "but it had to be done." Her breath left her on a sigh. Silence fell. He stood slowly, grimacing as his sword grated against bone and slid back through flesh, turning the air thick with the stench of blood. He stared down at the old fate where she lay, crimson pooling outwards from beneath her and blossoming on the front of her white robe. He carefully cleaned his blade and sheathed it, the dull feeling in his chest growing heavier as he gazed upon her. It had to be done. He turned away from her, pivoting slowly on his heel to face the opposite direction, his gaze falling on the mountains that rose in the distance to pierce the endless blue sky. It has to be done. Someone had to pay. The Moirai hadn't been the only ones to fail her. The dark urge returned, a cold blast that stole the last of the heat from him, filling him with only ice and pain, and a terrible need for vengeance. It wasn't sated. Wouldn't be until it was done. He stalked forwards, his long strides gaining pace as he closed the distance between him and the mountain. It had to be done, even when he knew it would only end in his death. The agony churning inside him, the pain and the fury, the despair, all reached boiling point as he left the temple behind and sprinted across the velvet green grass towards Mount Olympus. It was too much. It swallowed him, stole control and made him a slave to it, to the dark and terrible need, the all-consuming desire for revenge. On a violent bellow, he stepped into the darkness of the underworld and out into the temple that topped the mountain, looking down on everything, everyone. The temple of his uncle, Zeus. Valen glared at him where he stood in the center of the temple's grand hall, his thigh-length white robes crisp and perfect beneath his gold armor, while Valen's own armor bore her blood and that of the Moirai, his skin stained crimson. While Valen struggled to breathe, was consumed by emotions that bombarded him, Zeus's worn face was set in an expression that revealed no shred of feeling, his golden eyes emotionless as they watched him from beneath the delicate twisted band of his crown. How could the bastard be so calm? How could he stand there and do nothing? Valen clenched his hands into fists at his sides, Squeezed them so tightly his arms shook as he wrestled for control, tried to claw back some sanity and drive back the darkness that pushed him to attack. His chest heaved with each hard breath he drew as he fought the pain that threatened to tear him apart. It was no use. That pain scattered the pieces of himself he had clawed back together, and the lure of the darkness was too powerful to resist. Rage boiled in his veins, stoked by seeing his uncle unaffected by her death. So fierce now he felt he would burst if he didn't let it out, didn't let it consume him and control him. He needed it out. He unleashed a war cry that echoed around the huge temple and threw his right hand forwards, launching a white-purple bolt of lightning at his uncle. Zeus easily deflected it with a casual sweep of his left hand, sending it shooting towards the row of thick white marble columns to Valen's right. That only served to infuriate him even more. He shot another bolt and then another at Zeus, and again his uncle deflected them as if they were nothing. If he couldn't land a distance attack, there was only one thing he could do. He blinked away the tears and ran at his uncle. Zeus's golden eyes widened. Valen slammed his right shoulder into the bastard's gut before he could move, grunted as the gold armor he wore over his short white robe sent fierce hot pain rolling down his arm and back, and gritted his teeth against it as he drove forwards. If Zeus was going to deflect everything he threw at him, he would just have to get close enough to him that he wouldn't have time to defend himself. Zeus grunted as his back hit one of the towering marble columns, and Valen roared as he pressed his hands to his uncle's chest and unleashed everything he had. Lightning shot from his palms, spreading in sharp, jagged tendrils across the gold plates of Zeus's armor. The bastard finally reacted, throwing his head back and bellowing as lightning tore through him. He would make his uncle feel the same pain as he did, wouldn't stop until he felt as battered and broken inside. Valen gritted his teeth and pressed harder against Zeus's chest, unleashed more of his power, not relenting even when his head turned and limbs shook. If it took everything he had to make his uncle pay, then he would give it. He would keep giving it until it killed him. For her. Something firm pressed against his chest. He looked down, frowned at the sun-kissed skin of the familiar hand plastered against his breastplate, screamed as he was sent flying backwards so fast the world was a blur, and then it erupted in pain, white-hot agony. Every inch of him blazed with it as he smashed through a column and hit the floor, sliding across it. The heavy top half of the column broke away from the ceiling and struck the marble floor, shaking it just as he came to a halt. He clenched his jaw against the pain pulsing through him like a wave of lightning strikes, and fought to get it back under control so he could finish what he had started. When it had dulled to a more manageable level, he grunted and rolled onto his front, grimaced as he pressed his hands into the cold white marble floor, and every part of him ached in protest, another 1,000 hot needles pricking his skin. He pushed through the pain and eased up onto his knees, froze when he saw white leather boots in his vision, the elaborate gold plates affixed to them reflecting his face back at him. His eyes were black, his canines little more than fangs. He shook away the fear that gripped him and steeled himself. Even if the darkness consumed him entirely, he wouldn't stop. He looked away from his reflection and sat back on his heels. Zeus towered over him, his golden eyes ablaze and narrowed on him, the soft waves of his dark brown hair curling around the nape of his neck and brushing his forehead, slipped from his delicate gold crown that formed a band around his head. "Will you stop?" His uncle's deep voice boomed around the temple. Valen shook his head. He couldn't, even when he knew his uncle would kill him, was too powerful for him to defeat. The pain was too much, burned too fiercely in his soul, blazing in his heart. It demanded retribution. It demanded blood. It demanded that others suffered as much as he was. "There has already been enough suffering, wrought by your own hands, nephew. Get out of my head!" Valen sprang at him and slammed his right fist hard into his jaw, snapping his head to his right. Zeus shifted his right foot back to brace himself, and that was the only reaction Valen got from the bastard. He didn't understand how Zeus could be so calm. His niece was dead. Why didn't it rake at him as fiercely as it killed Valen? Didn't his uncle give a damn about her? Clearly not. Zeus had stood by and allowed her to die, after all. He had let it happen. He had stood there and had done nothing. It was his fault, too. Valen snarled, all the darkness of the underworld pouring through him, bleeding from his hands and his skin, mingling with his lightning as it sparked from his fingers. He screamed and flew at his uncle, lost to the pain and the darkness, a slave to his need to satisfy them both. He lashed out with his right hand, catching Zeus with a whip made of pure lightning. It snapped and cracked as it struck Zeus's chest, knocking him backwards. Zeus's face darkened, his golden eyes flashing brightly as power sparked from his hands. Lightning to match Valen's. Zeus drew his hand through the air and golden arcs of lightning struck all across the temple. Valen hurled himself forwards as one shot from the ceiling directly above him, rolled across the white marble and came onto his feet. He snarled and lashed out with his white-purple whip again, sparks flying from it as it cut through the golden bolts, crashing down all around him. The blazing arc of his own power hit a sheer wall of crackling gold before it could strike Zeus down. Zeus flicked his right hand towards Valen. Valen stepped, dodging the attack, and appeared on the other side of the temple just as the golden bolt struck the wall where he had been, and shards of marble exploded outwards, raining down in a misty haze of dust. He grinned and swept his left hand up in a fast arc. White-purple bolts of lightning shot up from the marble floor, growing larger as they neared Zeus, racing towards him in a wave. Zeus turned and sidestepped, and Valen growled as the attack rolled straight past him. That growl was short-lived. It became a roar of agony as a bright streak of gold struck him in his chest and sent him flying across the room again. The scent of singed leather filled his nostrils, and he cried out again as fire seared his chest, the metal of his breastplate burning against his bare skin. He hit the wall hard, grunted, and dropped to the floor, landing face first on the cool marble, breathing hard and crippled by pain as he desperately clawed at his chest piece, trying to get it off him. The scent of burning flesh joined that of the leather. He fumbled with the first clasp, arched forwards and screamed in pain as another bolt seared him, striking hard from above and sending electricity pouring through his body. The tinny taste of blood flooded his mouth. The odor of it filled his nose. The lightning abated. Valen wheezed through burning lungs, shaking on his side on the floor, sparks of electricity skittering over his skin and snapping at his flesh as his body fought to purge the lightning strike. His ears rang, the sound oddly watery, and heat ran from his left ear, trickled and tickled and then dripped to the floor. That same liquid threatened to fill his battered lungs, crawled up his throat and past broken lips. Boots appeared in his hazy vision, and he trembled as he tried to look up at their owner. He had to move. He had to finish this. He gritted his teeth and growled in despair as he found he couldn't, his body refusing to respond to his command, disobeying the dark need that still poured through him and urged him to destroy. He managed to lift his eyes to his uncle's face. There was no mercy in those golden eyes, no shred of pain. Zeus didn't care if he died, just as he didn't care that she was gone. Tears burned Valen's eyes, hatred blazing in his veins, directed at himself now, stoked by the anger that flowed through him and screamed that he was weak. He had failed. He hadn't been able to make those who had failed his sister pay their due. It was going to end here for him. It was going to end before he could see her safely home to the blessed isle where she belonged. Zeus raised his right fist, and a golden bolt appeared in it, crackling and sizzling as he held it fast. It was going to end here. Now. Zeus! The female voice rang around the damaged temple in Valen's broken ears. A flicker of light appeared in the darkness within him. Small at first, nothing more than a pinprick in the inky black. But it grew as her voice reached his ears and his heart, soothing them both. I beseech you, do not take Valen from me too. Zeus looked across at the female, a flicker of hurt finally showing in his eyes. Forgive him, she whispered and moved closer, near enough that Valen could feel her warmth and bathed in her light, and the desperate need to destroy gave way to a fierce need to see her. She stepped into view, hair the color of blood tumbling in soft waves around pale, slender shoulders. Her skin, drained of its usual color, turned to snow. Dark circles shaded her normally luminous green eyes. Black framed her delicate body, as if she had been wrapped in darkness, the same darkness that burned inside him and fought back against the light. A stark contrast to the pale green and white robe she usually wore, the color of mourning. Pain filled him again, fiercer than ever, and he ground his teeth and cried out, desperate to unleash it, desperate for his broken body to respond to his commands, to his burning need to avenge his sister. Persephone turned tear-filled eyes down at him, and that need only grew stronger. But in turn, his body seemed to grow weaker, unable to bear the exertion of his desire to move, let alone fuel such a thing. A tear slipped onto her cheek, a pure diamond, and she looked back at his uncle. "Forgive my son." She clenched her hands in front of her chest, and her fine eyebrows furrowed, her rosy lips trembling as she spoke. "He is angry. He is hurt by the loss of his sister. We all are. But Valen is so passionate, so much like you. He cannot hold back that pain as the others can. It is in his nature to unleash it, and that is all he has done." Zeus's golden eyes turned cold. "What he has done is murder the Moirai." "And that is something you can undo," she said without inflection, without a single shred of anger in her voice. But Valen could see it in his mother. She was seething, burning with pain just as he was. She stepped closer to Zeus, her green eyes darker than Valen had ever seen them, and brambles grew from around her feet, twisted black vines of thorns that spoke of her pain, her suffering. "But you will not be able to undo the damage you will cause if you take Valen from me too. If you take him from Hades, there will be no coming back from that." The darkness in her voice and in her eyes shocked Valen. What had become of the gentle creature he loved so deeply? She had transformed into a warrior carved from the same material as he was, hardened by grief and determination. Zeus stared at her. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then into an eternity. His uncle lowered his hand, and the bolt faded from it. It was over. Valen had failed. Zeus would restore the Moirai, and everything Valen had done would be for nothing. His sister was still dead, and no one had paid for that crime. His uncle shifted his gaze down to him. "Love drove you to this, so it is love I will take from you." Zeus eased down to crouch beside him, and Valen flinched as he pushed him onto his back and placed his hand against the left side of his face. "You will never know it again." Valen screamed as fire blazed down the left side of his face, unable to move as it seared him, and the acrid stench of burning flesh filled his lungs once more. The flames spread, consuming his neck, eating away at him, and darkness threatened to rise and swallow him. Zeus's words rang in his ears as he stared up at him and saw only malice and hatred in his uncle's eyes. "Not even those who once favored you will love you now." Valen shook his head, silently pleading his uncle not to do it, not to take that from him. He had been wrong. Someone was paying for what had happened. He was. Chapter 11. Valen shot up in bed, breathing hard, his hand pressed against the left side of his face and his neck, where his favor mark had once been. His racing heart slowly steadied, panic and pain gradually flowing from him and restoring his balance, and the world came into focus around him. He frowned at the row of wooden wardrobes that took up the entire wall opposite him, and then across to his left at the windows that punctuated the pale yellow wall and revealed a rainy day in Rome. His bedroom. He was home, not on Mount Olympus. He hunched forwards, pulled his knees up beneath the white sheets, and buried his head in them as he breathed, narrowing the world back down so he could settle his tumultuous feelings and calm his body and mind. The scar on the left side of his face throbbed as if it had just happened, and he held it, willed his body to shut down the pain faster because he couldn't deal with it right now. He hated the nightmares, the memories that refused to leave him. They always made him feel like shit. A niggling voice at the back of his mind said the nightmare he had just lived through wasn't the only reason he felt as if someone had just dragged him through the river Acheron by his ankles. He tried to recall what had happened before the nightmare, groaned as it came back to him, and held his head, squeezing it hard. If he was lucky, it would burst under the pressure and he wouldn't have to deal with the inevitable fallout. Voices traveled into the room from the corridor to his right, ripping another low moan of despair from him. Seemed he didn't even have time to gather his shit before the storm hit him. His brothers were here, probably waiting for him to wake up so they could tear him a new one or two. Maybe even disown him entirely this time. Valen flopped back on the bed. He was damned if he was going out there until he was good and ready, or they came to get him. He didn't need a confrontation right now, when his head was pounding and his emotions were all over the place, his bastard mind finding it funny to keep hurling snippets of his nightmare at him whenever he started to calm down, throwing him back into turmoil. He caught a flash of Zeus staring down at him, and his scar burned hotter. He rubbed at it, frowning at the ceiling and cursing his uncle. The debate grew more heated, and he tuned into it because he figured he might as well hear what they were yelling about him. It was always good to prepare for battle, and what better way to prepare was there than knowing exactly what was going to get thrown at you? It was certainly a good way to kill the time it would take them to decide to check on him and bring the fight to him. It could have been worse. It could have been speed or coke, or whatever that shit is that mortals love putting in their bodies. Ares sounded more angry than usual. Megan clearly wasn't seeing to his needs enough to bring all that testosterone down to a manageable level. Kara snapped back. It is bad enough. A city without its guardian is a vulnerable one. We need to know what we are dealing with here. Valen cringed. He was in deep shit. Deeper than normal. Kara sounded ready to kick him back to the underworld for an audience with their father, or teleport him to Mount Olympus. Zeus's words rang in his ears, a continuation of the punishment he had thankfully woken up in the middle of, only to find himself plunged into another nightmare situation. I banish you from Mount Olympus, on penalty of death. He listened harder, trying to detect just how pissed Karis was with him. He didn't think his oldest brother would go so far as to dump him on Mount Olympus, a place he wasn't allowed to go under any circumstances, but he wasn't 100% certain, which sucked. Love drove you to this, so it is love I will take from you. A familiar voice pierced his heart, coming from the other room, rising above his brother's argument. You will never know it again. Valen snorted at that, as if he needed the reminder. He lived with it every day, every second he was awake and even in his sleep. He was bone-deep aware of the curse his uncle had placed on him. No one could love him, not even her. And I've told you 1,000 times, I will only speak with Valen. She would only speak with him. He wished his stupid chest hadn't warmed in response to that. What it contained clearly hadn't received the message she had thrown at it loud and clear the other morning. She wasn't interested in him. She just isn't going to change her tune, Ares again. There's no point in pressing her. Merrick's warm, deep voice joined the din, a touch of amusement in it that had Valen straining to hear what he was saying. Clever. I'll give her that. What better way to ensure her survival than to make us wait until Valen is awake? That wasn't amusement in his voice. It was admiration. Valen flew from the bed, tossing the covers across the room, and dragged his black jeans on. He buttoned them as he stormed into the wood-paneled corridor, darkness swirling through his veins, pouring into his soul. A snarl curled from his lips. The room ahead of him fell silent. His mood plummeted faster when he scanned the room, registering Ares, Merrick, and Karis all standing on the left side of it near the bookcases that lined the wall between the windows and the fireplace, and then Ava opposite them on the black leather couch in front of him. Guarded. Her guard was Megan, but it was still a fucking guard. He supposed it was better than finding one of his brothers sitting with her on the couch. He would have lost his shit if he had seen that. As it was, he wanted to kill Merrick for daring to speak about Ava with admiration in his fucking voice. He snapped his focus to the brunette bastard. Merrick eased a step back and held his hands up at his sides. causing the rolled-up sleeves of his charcoal linen shirt to tug back against his tanned forearms. "Easy? Fuck easy." He stormed towards him, unable to contain the urge rolling through him, a dark desire to acquaint his brother's head with the wall. Karis stepped in front of him. "I should have known you would be the same after you woke up. Always looking for a fight. Do you never consider the consequences of your actions?" Valen glared at him. He wanted to say fuck the consequences too, but Karis had that look in his green eyes, the one Valen knew meant trouble. They were empty, no trace of feeling in them. It was like looking into a void, a carcass without a soul inside it. It moved, spoke, and acted like Karis, but something was wrong with it, something dangerous. He backed off a step, turned his glare on Merrick so his brother got the message, and then scrubbed a hand over his hair, shoving the irritating lengths out of his face. He glanced over his shoulder at Ava. Her wide blue eyes ran over him, back and forth, up and down, heating him by degrees until he was burning inside. There wasn't a trace of desire in them, though, not as there had been on the dance floor. The only emotion he could read in their incredible, tranquil depths was surprise. He couldn't blame her. He remembered enough about what had happened back at the bar to recall that he had been injured, some of those cuts severe in mortal terms, and now those wounds were gone, not even a scar remaining. Karis sighed. Valen braced himself. "Do you have any idea the damage you might have caused?" his brother said, that calm tone setting him even more on edge. Valen looked back at him. A flicker of darkness crossed Karis's green eyes, a brief shadow, the only hint that he was feeling anything in there, that there was still a soul left in his body. "If we hadn't arrived when we had. Gods, Valen, what in our Father's good and gracious name were you thinking? Were you even thinking?" Valen waited, could see it coming, brewing on the horizon in his brother's eyes. Those emotions his brother kept in check so well were boiling now, writhing and seething, slowly breaking free of the hold he had on them. "No excuses," Karis bit out, and his eyes finally brightened, molten emeralds flecked with gold and silver. "Just like you, I suppose. You do something rash, something stupid, and expect us to clean up the mess. We end up being the ones who have to piece everything back together again because you do not give a damn what happens. You do not give a damn about anything." Valen held his gaze, refusing to look away even when he wanted to. He deserved his brother's wrath, because he had well and truly fucked up this time. He would take it like a champ, but no amount of harsh words would be punishment enough for his crime. Part of him wished Karis would lose it too, would turn this battle of words into one involving fists, but his damned brother was in control today. "I had information and—" Ava cut herself off when Karis turned cold eyes on her. She had information and she only wanted to give it to Valen. He found that oddly pleasing, as if she trusted him. Gods only knew why. He was the last person in the world anyone should trust. He was the last person in the world anyone would trust. Karis made that clear as he laid the accusations at his feet, and his two other brothers joined in. "It was stupid, Valen, and you know it. You know the rules." Ares this time, and Valen wanted to fly at him, but he held his ground, clenched his fists at his sides, and kept taking it. "Stupid does seem to be his middle name at times, but I think we should—" A brave attempt by Merrick to calm the situation, exactly what Valen expected from him, but he could have at least not insulted him at the same time. "Not stupid," Karis interjected. "He knows what he is doing when he does it. He knew the reason we are not allowed to drink alcohol. He always knows exactly what he is doing, and what the consequences will be, and he does it anyway." His oldest brother stared him down. "You act without thinking." Karis stepped towards him, black bleeding across his irises. "You always have, and look where it gets you. You break the rules and we all pay for it. You are the same now as you were back then. Gods, some days I am glad Calendria is not in the Blessed Isle to see what you have become." Ares gasped. Merrick stared at Karis in disbelief. Valen staggered back a step, heart racing, blood pounding in his ears. his eyes wide as he took that verbal blow to his chest, a knife that his brother seemed to take pleasure in plunging into his heart. He flicked a glance down at Ava and caught the fury in her blue eyes as she glared at Karis, but another emotion overshadowed it as she shifted to look at him. Disappointment. He took another step back, unable to breathe as she twisted the knife in his heart. It was too much. She already looked at him the same way as his family did. His mother was wrong. He was cursed. No one could ever love him. He closed his eyes and stepped. Chapter 12. The fact that Valen had just disappeared in a black swirl of smoke should have freaked Ava out, but she was too angry with his brothers, too riled by the verbal barbs they had thrown at him, and a little mad at Valen, too, for not defending himself and telling them the truth. She shot to her feet, her legs shaking as Karis's impassive green eyes landed on her, awareness that he could easily kill her despite all of her training rushing through every inch of her. Anger pushed all the fear to the back of her mind, though, and gave her the strength to give him a piece of it. "He drank it because of me!" Aries' dark eyebrows shot up. Merrick looked equally as surprised. Karis's expression didn't shift to show a single jot of emotion. She made a low growling noise and paced around the couch, trying to work off some of her energy before she did something stupid like unleash it on him. Valen deserved a good smack around the head, too. Why hadn't he fought his brothers? Why had he let them say all that shit about him to his face without putting up a fight or setting them straight? She looked at them where they formed a rough line, their backs to the windows that revealed a rain-swept Rome. They hadn't exactly given him a chance to defend himself, and they had cut her off when she had tried to help him. Maybe they were always this way with him and it was easier for him to take it. Or maybe he felt he deserved it. "If he drank it because of you, why did he not say that?" Karis broke the thick silence and she glared at him, itching to snatch her guns off the side table where he had placed them after taking them away from her and stick one where the sun didn't shine. "You didn't give him a chance!" She almost took a step towards him, reined herself in at the last second and clenched her fists instead. "You had already made up your mind about him, hadn't you? Anything he said wouldn't have made a shit of difference." She shook her head as she thought about how he had looked, the pain that had been in his eyes when he had glanced at her. He hid it well, had taken all their abuse without flinching, but Karis had managed to strike something locked deep within Valen, and he had struck it hard. He had hurt him. His own brother. Memories flickered in the back of her mind, a dim past she didn't want to recall, an argument that echoed in her ears and then faded as she mastered her emotions again. Her past was just that. It was over. What had happened then meant nothing now. Her family were gone, left in that dim memory, and she was glad of it. They had only caused her pain, just as Valen's family only hurt him. Her fists shook at her sides, the pain of her past mingling with the present, blurring together to stoke her anger to a dangerous new level, ratcheting it up until she was perilously close to losing her temper. She stared at Merrick, then at Aries, and finally Karis, hoping her words hit their mark. "You act as though he's fucked up. If he is, then it is all your faults. You don't know him at all. You don't see the hurt, do you?" She narrowed her eyes on Karis and bit out, "You don't see his pain." She turned on her heel and stormed away, heading for the exit. Someone grabbed her and she caught their hand, twisted it off her, and shoved, sending him staggering backwards into the side of the couch. Merrick. He huffed and tried to grab her again. "Let her go." He froze as Karis's command rang through the room. Ava looked back at the bastard. Maybe she had been wrong. Karis took the crown from Benares. He was the king when it came to arseholes. He sighed, raked long fingers through his wild black hair, and actually dared to look genuinely sorry. "I will find Valen and bring him back, if you will stay." Ava shook her head, almost laughed at that. He only wanted her to stay because she had information. He didn't really care about her or Valen. "Don't bother. Leave Valen alone. I'll find him myself." She snatched her leather jacket from the back of the couch, strode away, and paused at the door with the handle in her grasp. She didn't look back at him. "Some brothers you all are. You make me glad I no longer have a family." She yanked the door open and slammed it behind her, and broke into a dead sprint before any of them could think to stop her. She took the steps quickly, heart wrenching up into her throat when she missed one and almost fell. She grabbed the banister and managed to stop herself, and sank to her backside on the steps as it dawned on her. She wasn't sure where to start looking for Valen. She couldn't go to the bar as it had been closed off by the police, and the club he normally frequented wouldn't be open. She thought about the hill where she had seen him a few times while she had been tailing him to gather information on him. Would he be there? She didn't want to think too hard about the things she had seen, because she felt as if she was going mad whenever she tried to make sense of them. But if someone could theoretically teleport, would there be a limit to the distance they could cover? Could he have teleported to the hill? Her stomach turned and she rubbed it, trying to get it to settle, and vowed not to think about teleporting people and bizarre powers any more today. Even if he could magically zip from one place to another, she couldn't. If she was going to get to the hill, then first she needed to get home. It was a starting point, and she badly needed one right now. Needed a direction so she felt as if she was doing something, moving forwards rather than standing still. Moving closer to him again. She pushed onto her feet and made it to the foyer of the building, and then out into the street. Rain poured down, saturating her in seconds. The weather had been atrocious since they had brought Valen home over a day ago. Her stomach turned again, the memory of how she had gotten there making her want to vomit. She pushed it out of her mind and told herself she had imagined it. One of them hadn't grabbed her and teleported with her. She flagged a taxi and slid into the back seat. A whole damn day she had sat in that living room with his brothers watching her. The woman Megan had been kind, taking care of her and making sure she ate something. The men had just glared at her and discussed Valen. Ava sighed and rested her head against the window of the cab, watching the streets fly past. They had been so different. There had been concern in their voices, even in Karis's. Where had those feelings of warmth gone when Valen had woken up and come into the room? They had given her the impression they cared about their brother, and then they had shown her just how wrong she had been about them. They were just like every other family, just like the one she had left behind, full of betrayal and false feelings. The sensation that had been growing inside her from the moment she had started on her mission and first set eyes on Valen came into focus, revealing itself to her at last. Kinship. The feeling that he had a similar soul to hers, a similar story behind his journey into the darkness, that they were one and the same. The urge to find him grew stronger, pressing at her, and she quickly exited the taxi as it pulled up outside her apartment building and hurried across the cobblestones of the square to it, intent on finding him and letting him know that no matter what he thought, he wasn't alone. Ava punched in the code on the silver box beside the arched entrance, waited for the buzz, and pushed the small gate set into the huge arched wooden doors open. She stepped over the threshold and went to close it behind her. Blinked. Valen stood in the middle of the square, rain rolling down his bare chest, a distant, empty look in his golden eyes. "You promised me information." Those words had a hollow ring to them, too, as if he wasn't quite with her. Was it because of the things his brothers had said to him? Who was Calindria, and what had happened to her? The hurt she spied hidden beyond the emptiness in his eyes told her not to ask, because that spot was still sore from Karis's attack on it. "Did you track me here?" She leaned out of the entrance and looked around the square. No sign of his brothers. "I wouldn't leave you alone with them." Because he didn't trust them with her. It was all there in his eyes for her to read. He had come flying out of his bedroom to attack Merrick, and she wanted to ask why. Replayed what his brother had said just before he had appeared and found no reason for him to have reacted to it. Merrick had merely sounded impressed that she was savvy enough to know having Valen around when she gave them all the information she had was a wise thing to do, a way of stopping them from disposing of her when she was no longer useful to them. Or was it because Merrick had sounded impressed with her that Valen had launched that attack? His eyes narrowed on her from across the small square, heeding her in the way she feared they always would when he looked at her like that, as if she belonged to him. "You followed me," she whispered, a little breathless. Because he had wanted to protect her. He had wanted to protect what he viewed as his. "It wasn't difficult. Far too easy, in fact. You owe me information." He walked up the slight incline towards her, his bare feet silent on the dark cobblestones, and stopped close to her, towering over her in a way that forced her to tip her head back to keep her eyes locked on his. His golden eyes darkened, heating her outwards from her chest, and she secretly sucked in a breath to steady herself. He lowered his head until his mouth hovered barely an inch from hers, and whispered, "I want it now." Ava swallowed hard. He wanted it. She felt like an idiot when he moved back a step, and it hit her what it was. Information. That was all he wanted from her. Nothing else. His eyes were cold again, the heat that had been in them erased as if it had never existed. Was any of this real, or was she dreaming it all? It felt more like a nightmare, one that was twisting her in knots and getting stranger by the second. She never should have taken the job. She looked up at Valen, into golden eyes that shone in the low light, a fierce possessive fire lighting them up again as he gazed down at her. But then she never would have met him. Ava lifted her hand without thinking and lightly feathered her fingers over the left side of his face. He scowled and knocked her hand away and distanced himself, the darkness back in his eyes, the heat destroyed by her carelessness this time. She should have known he wouldn't allow her to touch that part of him, not as he had the other woman, his mother. He looked off to his right. Panic lanced her. "Wait!" His golden eyes slid toward hers, and his eyebrow rose. She had surprised him with that outburst and command. She had surprised herself, too. It wasn't like her to act this way, to let her emotions control her like this. She had spent years honing her skills as an assassin, including the ability to keep her heart shielded and feelings in check, distancing herself from the world so she could do her job. Valen had undone all of that in a matter of days, in a single moment. The very second she had come into contact with him that night in front of the Pantheon. He looked as though he might leave anyway, as if he felt as uncomfortable as she did, out of sorts and traversing unknown waters, dangerous waters. She wasn't sure how to process what was happening either, but she wasn't going to run away from it. She wasn't that sort of woman. She also wasn't the sort of woman who made a deal and then backed out of it. "I owe you information." It was a reasonable excuse for wanting him to stay. She frowned as a group of women eyed him as they walked past and began talking amongst themselves, whispering things that she couldn't hear but could guess at. It wasn't difficult. He was standing bare-chested in the middle of the square, every inch of his delicious honed torso on view. It was bound to draw attention from female eyes and stir desire in some of them. A dark urge to grab his arm and yank him into her apartment building, away from the eyes of other women, rushed through her, and she barely tamped down that desire. "Come inside." It was better than grabbing him, but he reacted much the same, both eyebrows snapping up and his golden eyes going wide as he looked from her to the building and back again. His pupils dilated, but the desire that shone in them lasted barely a second before he had it under control and crushed out of existence. "Fine," he snapped and sauntered towards her, a sensual, almost predatory gait to his step. Her body heated, skin flushing beneath her clothes, and her mind raced forwards, conjuring images of him gathering her into his arms and kissing her as he had back in his apartment. He stopped right in front of her, looked down into her eyes, and the coldness in them hurled her out of her fantasies and back to cruel reality. "I thought you wanted to let me in." She did, and not only into her apartment. A foolish endeavor. They were assassins, born to lead a lonely life, and getting involved with him would only make it more difficult on her. Remembering the nights she passed in his arms before he inevitably left her, the stolen moments they had shared wouldn't bring her comfort when she was alone again. They would only torment her. Ava stepped aside and let him past, and closed the door behind him, shutting out the women with their prying eyes. She turned around and found herself face to face with Valen. In the low light, his eyes seemed to glow as he looked down at her, a softness to them that hadn't been there a moment ago, and was gone when he blinked. "It's probably best we do this in my apartment." She wasn't sure it was the greatest idea, not when his eyes widened slightly, and not when they followed that by narrowing on her in suspicion. God, she couldn't make sense of him. He sent her in circles, had her spinning so quickly she wasn't sure what was up and what was down. One second he was looking at her as if he might die if she stopped kissing him, if she distanced herself, and the next he was looking at her as if she might be the one to kill him, and he felt nothing when he was around her. She pushed the unruly emotions back down, brought up her guards to form a wall around her heart, and crossed the courtyard, heading for the door into the building. Valen tailed her, threatening to undo all her hard work to control her feelings and slip into a more businesslike gear, when he raked his eyes over her and she felt it, that hot zing that went through her whenever he looked at her. It followed the path of his gaze, forming small lightning strikes over her curves. Ava had half a mind to turn on him and tell him to stop. She couldn't do this. She wouldn't. She was an assassin. She wasn't just another woman for him to bed and leave either. She never had been able to play that way. Ever since she had first awoken as a woman, had her first kiss with a boy at the village near where she had grown up, she had been deadly serious about relationships, falling deep and hard for the object of her affection, even when she had known it would only end with her heart being broken. This time she felt that more keenly than ever. But Valen wouldn't only break her heart. He would tear it from her chest and take it with him when he left. She unlocked the door and moved swiftly up the floors, a desire to get this over with and let him leave brewing inside her as her thoughts led her down dark paths. She didn't bother to check if he was following her, and didn't slow, practically running up the stairs to the top floor. She opened the door to her apartment and stepped inside the large open-plan space. One of the first things she had done on moving in had been removing the walls, creating no place where an enemy could lay in wait for her. She kept the door to the bathroom open at all times, giving her a clear view into the space beyond her bedroom on the left side of the expansive room. A low wall separated her bedroom area from the living area in the center of her apartment, and to her right a long island formed the barrier between it and the kitchen. Beyond the kitchen, set into the right wall, was another door. That one she kept closed, because there wasn't enough room in the shallow closet for anyone to hide there. It housed her arsenal of weapons. She crossed the room, the wooden floorboards creaking under her slight weight. When Valen started to follow her, the noise grew louder and then suddenly stopped. A few squeaks of wood rubbing followed it, and she looked back at him from the kitchen island to find him testing the floor with his bare right foot, pressing down and lifting it again, a frown on his face. He lifted his golden eyes to meet hers. "You might want to get the floor fixed." She smiled and shook her head, causing her short hair to tickle the nape of her neck, sensitizing her skin and making her want to shiver in a good way. Or maybe that was Valen's presence and the way he was staring at her, setting her body alight and making her hyper-aware of him where he stood in her apartment, his defined chest exposed to her and stirring wicked hungers, needs that were impossible to deny when she was around him, no matter how hard she tried to control herself. She struggled to tamp down that reaction to him and kept walking to the end of the wooden kitchen island. "It's intentional. I picked up the idea in Japan. They call them nightingale floors. It was so they could hear any intruders who tried to enter the castles and deal with them before they could attack." She picked up the T-shirt off the pile of clothes stacked on the black granite worktop of the island, turned and tossed it across the room to him, hoping he would put it on and cover the glorious distraction that was his chest. He caught it, frowned at it, and then at her. "It's yours." He opened it up and held it out between his hands, his eyebrows rising. "You stealing my clothes now?" She shrugged. "Mine were wet." His eyes met hers over the top of his black T-shirt, sending a hot shiver tumbling down her spine, and sending her awareness of him shooting into the stratosphere. They were dark, desire pooling in them, stirring it in her. Was he thinking about that night? Her breathing shortened as memories popped into her mind, replays of how he had taken care of her, and how she had repaid him. He snapped his gaze back down to the t-shirt and put it on, covering all that wicked, alluring flesh just as she had needed him to. He muttered something, and when he looked back at her, that desire was gone again. Erased. Was it because she had denied remembering what had happened that night? She opened her mouth to ask him, but remembered how his brothers had treated him and the way he had acted, and other words came out instead. "Why didn't you tell your brothers the truth?" His golden eyes turned glacial. "I didn't come up here for this shit." "You should have told them, but you just let them say all that crap about you. Why?" He turned his back on her. "It's none of your damned business. If you're just going to start on me, then I'm leaving." Did he always run away from confrontations? No. She knew the answer in her heart, and with it came a realization that hit her so hard she had to lean on the worktop for support. He thought she was like them. The things they had said to him had reeked of disappointment, and now she was saying things that were giving him the impression she felt the same way, that he had disappointed her. "I just figured you would at least kick their arses like they deserved." She hoped he would look at her again, because she wanted to say something to him and he needed to see in her eyes that she wasn't lying. He remained with his back to her. If he wanted to do this the hard way, then she could do that, because he deserved to know the truth about his brothers. "They're arseholes." She walked towards him, the floorboards gently creaking beneath her with each step. "Complete stroncy." He tensed as she came up behind him, his back going rigid as her hand ghosted over it, ridiculous fear stopping her from touching him when she wanted to, because she knew it would give him comfort. Hopefully, her words would give him what she was too afraid to offer with a touch. She moved around him and he looked at her, a flicker of hurt in his eyes that remained when he blinked, and warmth suffused her, spreading outwards from her chest. He wasn't hiding his feelings from her. "They're arseholes. But they were worried about you." The light that had been in his eyes disappeared, the warmth leaving with it, and coldness swept in as they brightened. Not the reaction she had expected. She had thought he would be pleased to hear that, but it hadn't gone down well at all. He huffed and backed off a step, and she could almost see the barriers coming up, shutting her out again. "You don't know a fucking thing about my brothers. They don't give a fuck about me. Deep inside, they're probably pissed I'm not being punished, or I didn't end up getting myself killed." That was a harsh thing to say, and her heart went out to him when he looked away from her, staring off to his left towards the windows, and she realized he believed it, every word. He thought his brothers hated him. "Just give me the information." She frowned at his noble profile, cold stealing through her as he folded his arms across his chest and closed his eyes, completely shutting her out. "Very well." Ava rubbed the sore spot between her breasts, trying to soothe the ache building there. Her stomach felt heavy again, weighed down by guilt as she pieced together everything she knew about him and built that clearer picture. And it revealed that she had been a bitch. She had hurt him. He was convinced his brothers despised him, and she had the feeling that it went beyond just his family. He thought everyone hated him, even her. The things she had said to him had wounded him. She had denied sleeping with him and had told him in no uncertain terms it would never happen with him, that she didn't want him. She had rejected him just as his brothers did. But just like his brothers, the things she said to his face and how she felt inside were two very different things. And just like his brothers, she was a damned bitch for behaving that way, showing him only coldness and none of the warmth he made her feel, making him feel as if no one could love him. "Aries took care of you. Merrick too," she whispered, afraid to say it any louder in case he turned on her and lashed out. He was hurting, and delivering the truth to him gently would be more of a balm to his heart than hurling it at him. He might listen to her rather than rejecting her words outright. She remembered the way his mother had handled him, how gentle she had been. Valen needed that sort of touch. He was used to receiving the opposite, though. He frowned, his nostrils flared, and he sighed. Was she getting through to him? Or was he about to explode and lash out at her?
They care about you.
He tensed, and she decided to back off, to let it go and not press him any more. Small steps. It was better to deliver it gently and slowly than make him take it all in at once. Maybe he would believe her then. I care about you. She kept that one to herself. He definitely wasn't ready to hear that. She didn't need to see his eyes to know his mood was degenerating, turning dark and vicious again. Before he could snap at her that he wanted information and that was all, she decided to give it to him.
Benares is the man who hired me,
she said, and Valen opened his eyes and looked back at her, a steadiness in his gaze that soothed her nerves. Small steps. He had taken in what she had said to him about his brothers, and he believed her even if he wouldn't admit it. The hurt that had been in his beautiful eyes was gone now, but he hadn't killed it or hidden it from her. She had eased it.
Jin is apparently his sister, which if you saw how she acted around him, you would find as stomach-turningly disgusting as I do.
He almost smiled. The corners of his lips twitched, as if he wanted to do it, but his mouth remained flat and unyielding. Holding on to his anger towards her? A childish thing to do, but he was a man. Her years as an assassin had taught her that no one could hold a grudge like a man. I'm listening. He walked away from her, his bare feet leaving marks on her floor as their damp soles hit the warm wood.
I have trousers,
she said, and he frowned over his shoulder at her. She pointed towards the end of the kitchen island, and he looked there.
I borrowed those too.
Stole. He glanced at her, and she didn't deny it. Her gaze tracked him as he crossed the room and picked up the black combat trousers.
The bathroom is...
Her words died on her lips as he shoved his wet jeans down right in front of her, giving her a glorious view of long, lean legs and damp black trunks that clung wonderfully to his crotch. Her eyes widened as those trunks followed his jeans, revealing all of him to her. He paused and frowned at her. Stop staring. She folded her arms across her chest.
This from the man with no modesty?
He shrugged, stepped into the combat trousers, and tugged them up. His eyes locked with hers as he buttoned them. His wicked smile set her heart on fire. I figured it was nothing you haven't seen before. That heart pounded erratically against her chest, and she cleared her throat, and convinced her eyes to escape the hold his had on them. She hurried into the kitchen to the refrigerator and yanked the door open. She shoved her head inside and almost moaned as the cold air cooled her burning cheeks. Damn him. She had to stop letting him affect her so easily.
Drink?
She poked her head out of the refrigerator. He wasn't at the end of the island anymore. No thanks. Last time you offered me a drink, it didn't end well. His voice came from behind her, and she looked over her shoulder. He slumped onto her worn cream couch, stretched his arms along the back of it, and kicked his bare feet up onto the glass coffee table.
I'm still not entirely sure what happened, she said,
and the light left his expression again, turning his handsome face dark. I'm not entirely sure you want to know. Let's leave it at that. He was closing up again, shutting her out, protecting himself. She was entirely sure she wanted to know. She wanted to know the answers to the 1,000 questions causing a riot in her mind, 1,000 questions that were all centered around him. The stuff of dreams and nightmares. More nightmare than dream, but she still wanted to know. She wanted to know him. He didn't want her to know, though. That much was clear to her, together with his reasons. He thought that if she knew about him, about all the craziness that surrounded him, it would drive her away. Ava grabbed a bottle of water, closed the refrigerator, and crossed the room to him. His gaze tracked her, head tipping back as she came to stand over him.
I'll leave it at that, for now,
she said, letting him know in no uncertain terms that they weren't done on that subject. She would know about him. She would complete the picture. This Benares bloke, he said, and she wanted to smile at the way he had let her know that he was fine with her proposition, changing the subject rather than shutting her down. And his sister. What did they hire you to do? Ava sat on the coffee table near his legs.
Tail you, and give them all the information I could get on you. Habits, movements, people you knew, and anything personal I could find out.
You're really going to tell me all this? His frown spoke volumes, and she sighed.
You're only just trusting me?
He rolled his right shoulder. Is this another thing they want you to do? Ava shook her head.
No. They want me to sleep with you again.
His eyes widened slightly and then narrowed as he smiled, and she realized what she had said. Again. She had just admitted that she remembered sleeping with him the first time. Not only that, but she had said sleep with, not fuck. He looked as if he might prod a little into that, but then relaxed into the back of the couch, slumping further into the seat, looking altogether too at home in her apartment, as if he belonged here with her. Ridiculous. Yet it warmed the colder parts of her heart. So you're telling me this why? He looked her over again, scrutinizing every inch of her, as if he could spot an ulterior motive in her body. Or maybe he just wanted to look. She shirked her leather jacket and tossed it onto the couch next to him. His eyes darkened, desire flaring in them together with something else as he dropped his gaze to her chest. Anger. You show too much flesh all the time. Ava laughed at that and pointed at him.
You're one to talk. I wasn't the one parading around Rome topless.
I'm male. It's allowed. Meaning wherever he came from, women showing a little skin was frowned upon. He had awfully outdated sensibilities for a man who looked little more than 30 years old. She looked down at her black low-cut t-shirt. She wasn't even showing that much cleavage. She glanced at Valen and caught him staring again. The look in his eyes, the hunger that echoed in them, made her feel as if she had her breasts out and bare, completely exposed to him. She cleared her throat and he looked away from her, gazing off to his left again. A touch of color climbed onto his cheeks. She had figured him for a player, liable to use and discard women, always on the hunt for pleasure because of his tongue stud. Had she been wrong? Was he more like her than she had ever imagined possible? Someone who fell deep and fell hard, and found it impossible to do anything without feeling, and therefore remained at a distance from everyone to protect themselves. Why am I here? He whispered. Because he wanted information from her. Because he wanted to be with her. Her heart tore her between those two answers. Fear made her choose the safe option.
I promised you information, and got you into trouble. And my reason for giving you this information is to get you into trouble again.
He slowly turned his head towards her, and she didn't look away when his eyes locked with hers, because she wanted him to see the truth in them, and she needed to see the truth in his when he responded.
I want you to kill Benares.
A frown flickered on his brow, and he sat up, bringing his feet down onto the wooden floor, and resting his elbows on his knees as he leaned towards her, his eyes searching hers. Why? She fought the urge to glance away, to lie and make up some other reason to cover her weakness. His eyes softened. Why, Evangelina? God, no one had called her that in a long time, not since her mother had passed away. Fear hit her hard, her strength stripped away by the gentle look in his eyes and the concern in his deep voice.
Because I'm not strong enough, and his security is too tight for me to do it alone. And because he's going to kill me if I don't kill him first.
She closed her eyes when Valen growled, a sound that was more beast than man, a feral animal both vicious and wild, out for blood.
I know it. He called me to his villa to do it the other night, after our fight outside the Pantheon, but he gave me a second chance.
She tensed when warmth pressed against her cheek, steady and strong, flowing into her, and opened her eyes and looked into his. They were dark, colder than they had ever been, But in their depths, there was more heat and light than ever, too. "I won't let him kill you," he whispered, and smoothed his palm across her cheek, and she almost surrendered to the need to lean into that touch and steal more comfort from it. "Have you heard from them since?" She nodded.
When I came back here after leaving you the other morning, Jin tailed me. She gave me an order to seduce you again. I saw in her eyes that once they have what they want, it's game over for me. I've worked for powerful people, dangerous people, but they've always respected me. They've never—
"They're not going to kill you," he murmured again, and she wished she could believe that. The conviction in his eyes and in his voice this time told her to do just that, but it was still difficult. "I'll kill them first." She pulled away from him, pushed onto her feet, and paced across the room, hating the way she felt as her legs trembled beneath her with each step and her heart pounded. Pathetic. She was an assassin. She knew the game she played was dangerous and that one day it would come to a bloody end. She had always been fine with that. She had never feared death. Until she had met Valen. Now all she could think about was how badly she wanted to live. It was ruining her. She shoved her hands through her hair and pressed them against the sides of her head. "Ava," he whispered, and she shook her head, warning him not to come to her, not right now, not when she was weak. She was liable to fall into his arms again, and it would only chase away this nightmare for a short time, until her head cleared and the questions started again, tearing her apart. Had she slept with him because she wanted him? Or because she wanted to live and hoped Benares would allow that if she did as he ordered? "Do you think they follow you everywhere?" Valen's deep voice curled around her, a gentle embrace that kept her grounded and drove some of the panic away. She nodded.
Jin watches me and reports to Benares.
"Even now?" He was closer. She nodded and turned to look at him. His lips claimed hers, strong arms banding around her like steel and pinning her to his chest. She pressed her hands to his pecs, shivered as she felt hard muscles beneath her palms, and the thunderous beat of his heart. She didn't have the strength to push him away. She needed him too much. He skimmed his hands down her back to her bottom and clutched it as he kissed her, his tongue teasing hers, the pleasure that rolled through her in response chasing away her fear, filling the world with only him. She moaned and wrapped her arms around his neck and clung to him, kissing him back with every drop of desire that burned in her veins, all of the need that hummed in her bones and blazed in her heart. Valen groaned against her lips, slanted his head and deepened the kiss, leaving no part of her untouched. His shoulders shook beneath her hands as she caressed them, and she felt humbled by his reaction, by how fiercely she affected him as she kissed and touched him, as deeply as he affected her. He broke away from her lips, pressed his forehead against hers, and breathed hard against her lips, his hands trembling against her backside. "Seduce me." Chapter 13. Ava moaned at that proposition, shook with the force of the need to do exactly as he wanted and seduce him. Fear clawed its way back into her heart, though. If she did this, would it be because she wanted him or because she wanted to live? Would it be real, or a moment of make-believe designed to fool anyone who might be watching from the rooftops beyond the windows? One look into his eyes answered those questions for her. It would be because she wanted him as fiercely as he wanted her. It would be real for them both. She pulled herself up his body and captured his lips, and he moaned as she delved her tongue between them. An electric sizzle chased over her backside where he gripped her, and he broke away from her lips and released her. She frowned and tried to get close to him again, but he held his hands up between them. "1 second, just one." He breathed hard, sucking in each breath before expelling it on a sigh. "Maybe 2. He looked at his hands, and she looked there too. Blinked. She had to be imagining those tiny sparks chasing along his fingers. He shook his hands, and when he stopped, the sparks she had imagined were gone. "All good now." He grabbed her, hauled her up against him, and kissed her hard. She wanted to ask what all that had been about, but the power of speech left her as he kissed her and she felt his stud teasing her tongue, and imagined it elsewhere again. She had never been with a man with a piercing before. She clutched his shoulders, pulled him down to her, and kissed him harder, losing herself in the fantasy for a moment, shivering as she pictured him between her bare thighs, driving her wild. He groaned. "God, you smell good." She frowned at that and wanted to ask where it had come from, but he seized her mouth again, silencing her with another kiss. He turned with her and kissed along her jaw, down her neck, laving it with his tongue and turning her thoughts wicked again. She glanced off to her right towards the window. Was someone watching? Her gaze roamed to the bed beyond the low wall behind the couch. Could she do this while she thought someone was? She wasn't shy. She worked hard on her body, after all. But the idea of being with Valen while someone might be watching everything they did had her cheeks burning up. He chuckled against her throat. "Trying to set me on fire?" She eased her cheek away from him so he couldn't feel her embarrassment, but he didn't let her get far. He swept his lips up and kissed it, feathered his mouth along her jaw and nibbled her earlobe, teased it between his teeth and tugged on it. She couldn't hold back the moan that rumbled up her throat in response to that wicked teasing touch, or the reaction it pulled from her. She caught his cheek, shifted him to face her, and kissed him hard, ending it by sucking his lower lip and teasing him with her teeth. He groaned and gripped her harder, pinned her against his chest so the wild beat of his heart reverberated through her. Seduce him. He wanted it. She wanted it too. If this was a seduction, what would she do? She squeezed her thighs together as it came to her and trembled as pleasure rolled through her, brief but sweet. Valen glared at her when she moved back a step, breaking contact with him, and reached for her. She stopped him in his tracks by taking hold of his lower lip, squeezing it tightly between her finger and thumb and pulling him towards her. He tried to kiss her and she evaded him, earning herself a wicked growl of displeasure that sent another fierce bolt of heat shooting through her, and made her want to squeeze her thighs again. She ignored that need and led him towards the bed, tugging on his lip. His golden eyes darkened as they leaped to the double bed and then back to her, screaming at her that he wanted to pick her up and carry her to it. She shook her head, silently chastising him, and kept leading him, pulling him along with her. When she reached the bed, she released him, pressed one hand against his chest, and made him take a step back. She took one too, placing some distance between them, grabbed the hem of her t-shirt and pulled it off over her head. Another growl echoed through the room, causing more heat to pool between her thighs. She squeezed them and tossed her t-shirt onto the wooden floor. Her boots followed it, and then she shimmied out of her jeans and straightened. Valen stared at her, lips parted and eyes dark, hungry as they roamed over her exposed curves. She paid him back in kind, her eyes drifting over him, and wiggled her legs again when she spotted the hard outline of his cock in his combat trousers. Another hit of pure pleasure rolled through her in response to the sight of it tenting the black material and the memory of how good it had felt inside her, filling her up and stretching her, completing her. Her clitoris throbbed and she moaned. His gaze snapped up to meet hers. She was too enthralled with his hard-on to look at him. He moved, whipping off his t-shirt and dropping it on the floor. His fingers made quick work of his fly, and he shoved his trousers down, his cock springing up as he freed it, tearing another moan from her. She glided towards him as he stepped out of his trousers, eyes fixed on his hard length, the need to touch it too fierce to deny. He tensed as she made contact, trembled as she eased her hand down to expose the blunt head, and moaned as she kept going and fondled his balls. His hips jerked towards her, a sign of his hunger that thrilled her. Ava wrapped her hand around his cock and led him towards the bed. She stepped up onto the cream covers and kneeled on the bed. The front of his legs hit the side of the mattress, and he lifted one knee onto the bed. Ava stopped him by bending over and wrapping her lips around the soft head of his length. He groaned, and his hand came down on her shoulder, shaking against her as she took him into her mouth. She pressed one hand against his thigh, spreading his legs further, and then lowered it to his sack. He trembled as she tugged on it and rolled it in her palm, stroked the spot behind his balls, and teased him. "Ava," he breathed, and his left hand found her hair, twirled the dark lengths around his fingers, and gripped her hard. He grunted as she sucked him, pressing her tongue into the underside of his long cock and swirling it around the sensitive tip. Gods! His balls drew up. He pushed her back, panting hard, and shook his head when she brought her lips back to him. She smiled and mercilessly licked the head, teasing the crevice with the tip, and he shuddered and moaned, tipped his head back, and caused every inch of his body to tense so deliciously that she instantly squeezed her thighs together and rubbed them, swaying her hips to give herself a little hit of pleasure of her own. She licked up the length of him and flicked her tongue over the head, and he tensed further, delighting her hungry eyes. The muscles in his jaw popped, his cock throbbed in her hand. Any more and he would be climaxing, and what sort of seduction would that be? She wanted him inside her when he found release. She wanted to feel it again. Ava shuffled backwards on the bed, luring him by his hard shaft onto it. When both of his knees were on the bed, she led him to the padded cream headboard, made him turn around, and pushed him onto his back. She sat back and gave herself a moment to admire him as he lay before her, each hard breath straining his muscles, making her quiver with the need to lick and touch him. Heaven, he was perfect. His hand shot up to clutch the headboard as she leaned over him and licked his cock from root to tip, and she moaned at the sight of him. She hadn't thought it possible for his muscles to become any more tense than they had been, but he had managed it. His lean, powerful body called to hers, filled her with an urge to have him inside her. She moaned, humming against the head of his cock as she teased it with her tongue, and he shuddered. That trembling worsened when she shifted to face him and slung her right leg over his hips. She rubbed him between her thighs, needing a little hit of pleasure before she really kicked her seduction into gear. His hands came down on her thighs, grasped her hips, and guided her as he strained, his face twisting in pleasure. Ava raised her hips and denied him again. He made a noise that was somewhere between a groan and a growl, but he didn't try to stop her when she crawled up the length of him. Her gaze zeroed in on his mouth. She leaned over him, her breast swaying above his chest, still caged by her black bra, and the need to kiss him gave way to a more powerful one that filled her, one she surrendered to willingly. She lifted her right hand and stroked her fingers through the wild, long lengths of his golden hair, brushing it back from his face so she could see all of him. Pools of liquid gold watched her closely, a touch of vulnerability in them that made her want to reassure him that she wasn't going to hurt him. She just wanted to drink her fill of him. Ava lightly caressed the gentle sweep of his forehead, followed the arch of his left eyebrow, and then traced the straight line of his nose. He nipped at her fingertip when she swept it across his lips, teasing them with a touch she knew would make them tingle. He was handsome whether he knew it or not, just the right amount of danger about his looks, in the twist of his lips and the flash of his eyes. She lowered her mouth and replaced her finger with her lips, before she did something foolish like trying to touch his scar again. He arched upwards to meet her, managed to somehow seize control of the kiss even though she was the one on top. She tugged on his lower lip with her teeth and released it, looked down at him again, and resisted the urge to kiss along his jaw because she would choose the left side, the scarred side. Instead, she flashed him a wicked smile and stroked her fingertip across his lip.
"Why do you have a tongue stud?"
She stared at his mouth. His lips curved into a smile. "Not for the reason you're thinking."
"You know that's what they're for, though, right?"
He shrugged. "It's for me, not for you."
"You sure?"
She pushed on his shoulders, forcing him down as she rose up onto her knees above him, bringing the apex of her thighs close to his face.
"Because it's about to be for me."
He groaned, fire flashing in his eyes as he lowered them to her knickers. He smoothed his palms up her thighs, and the fire in his eyes shifted to something else, something that had her slowing down and watching him. Fascination. She kept still as his strong fingers traced the tail of the dragon that curled around her left leg, his eyes tracking them, the fascination in them building as he reached her thigh and then her hip, the point where the ink disappeared around her back. His eyes shifted slowly across her stomach, as if he could see the design that danced across her back, and settled on her right side where the dragon emerged, its talons digging into her hip. He lifted his left hand and followed the design again, sending a hot shiver tripping across her skin and making it tingle. His golden eyes leaped ahead of his fingers and settled on the head of the black and violet beast on her stomach, and she wanted to look down it but couldn't take her eyes off him. He stole her breath. A few people had seen her tattoo, men included, but none of them had ever looked at it the way he was, had ever made her feel the design was sensual in some way, seductive and alluring, or that she was those things. He fingered the sapphire-colored gem nestled in her navel, sending another achy shiver through her as his skin brushed hers. "You have a piercing, too." He glanced up at her, the brief meeting of their eyes making the shiver that racked her grow fiercer, so powerful it stole her breath just as he did. "It was a diamond before." He trailed his hands across her stomach, stealing her voice as desire rolled through her in response, and lowered them to her hips. Anticipation built inside her, stoking the need and making her tremble, as his gaze dropped to his hands and he skimmed his fingers along the waist of her underwear. She gasped as he yanked his hands away from her, and the sound of lace tearing filled the room. The deep moan that issued from his kiss-swollen lips obliterated her desire to chastise him, filling it with another. A desire to hear him making sounds like that while he was inside her. She loved the sound of his pleasure. He slid his arms between her thighs, wrapped his hands over them, and pulled her down against his face. Her hands hit the top of the headboard and she gripped it hard, barked out a moan as his tongue stroked her, and the hard beat of his stud teased her. Oh, fuck. She hadn't been prepared for it to feel this good. She held onto the headboard, hands and arms shaking as he went to war, laving and teasing her with his tongue, swirling it around her sensitive bud and driving her out of her mind. For each moan she loosed, he answered her with a deep groan, as if the sound of her pleasure thrilled him as much as the sound of his thrilled her. She tried to keep still, but it was impossible as he slowed his pace, long strokes of his tongue that started at her core and ended with a flick or a swirl over her bud. Her thighs trembled against his hands and his shoulders, and she cried out as he dipped his tongue into her core, probed her with the tip, and sent her soaring. His hands shifted, claimed her backside, and dragged her against his face, and she couldn't hold back as he probed her again, fucking her with his tongue. "Valen," she moaned, and he stilled. Damn him. She rocked against his face and gritted her teeth when he still refused to move. A shriek left her as he moved so fast the room was nothing more than a blur, and she gasped as she found herself sitting in his lap and him facing her, something akin to astonishment in his eyes. It was gone a second later as his mouth claimed hers, fierce now, a demanding press that she surrendered to. She dug her nails into his bare shoulders and kissed him back, letting him know that she didn't mind that he had changed their tempo, and pretending she hadn't seen just how shocked he had been to hear her whispering his name in pleasure, with warmth and desire and need. What sort of hard life had he led to end up thinking that no one could love him? The sort of life she wanted to end right here, right now. She kneeled and he kissed across her breasts, pulled them free of the lacy cups and lavished them with his tongue, swirling it around her tight nipples before sucking them into his mouth and sending sparks skittering across her chest and down her stomach. It pooled between her thighs and she held on to him with one hand in the shorter, roughly chopped hair at the back of his head, keeping him where she needed him. With her other hand, she reached behind her and grasped his cock. He groaned and sucked her nipples harder as she stroked him, and then stilled as she guided him to her hot entrance and the blunt tip pressed inside. His breath was hot and fast across her chest as she eased down, savoring every hard inch of him as he filled her. His hand slipped to her backside again, and he held her as she wriggled, making sure every inch of him was inside her, or as much of him as she could take anyway. Hell, he was hot inside her, so hard and big. She grasped his hair, tugged his head back, and seized his mouth. He was quick to respond, taking command of the kiss as he moved her, helped her slide up and down his rigid cock. She couldn't do this slow. Her need for him had built too high already, almost at the precipice, and the rough way he grunted into her mouth and thrust her down onto his hard shaft each time she rose off it said he felt the same way. They both needed the same consuming madness they had experienced in their first time together. Ava moaned as he drove into her, struggled to keep kissing him as pleasure built inside her, bliss that said it would blow her away again when it came over her. She rocked against him, pressed her free hand against his thigh behind her and rode him hard, fast, delirious with a need to find release. He groaned and gripped her harder, clutching her backside and driving deep into her as his mouth dropped to her chest. She leaned backwards, groaned and shook as the position placed him deeper inside her, the angle making each long thrust of his cock hit the sweet spot. His mouth claimed her left nipple and sparks shot outwards from it. They skittered over her skin and she frowned as she swore they rushed from the spots where he held her backside too, tiny arcs of lightning that added to her pleasure, lit it up and set her on fire.
Valen,
she breathed and he growled and thrust harder. It wasn't enough. A gasp left her as her shoulders hit the bed, her hands falling away from him, and he drove hard into her, stroking her with every inch of his length as he leaned over her, holding her backside above his thighs where he still kneeled on the bed. The angle put him deeper still, so deep that it took only 2 delicious plunges of his cock to send her shooting beyond the precipice and right over the edge. She gripped the covers and couldn't stop her hips from rolling as hot pleasure swept through her body shaking so fiercely she feared she might fall apart.
Ava,
Valen husked, and sucked on her nipple, groaned against it as he thrust hard and deep, riding her climax and stretching it out. She sagged into him and the bed, breathless and boneless, and he grunted and tensed, jerked hard into her and shook as he followed her, length pulsing and throbbing wildly inside her, sending ripples of pleasure through her. She squeezed him, moaned and shuddered as the feel of him throbbing propelled her over the edge again with him. He collapsed against her, his head falling to rest between her breasts, hands still holding her hips, keeping her in place on him. Ava sighed out her breath. Damn. She wasn't sure she could move. The sound of her phone ringing shattered the silence. Valen lifted his head from her chest, the haze in his eyes dissipating as the phone continued with its melody. Answer it. He sounded groggy, as bone-deep satisfied as she felt, and damn, that made her feel good. She didn't want to because she knew what he did. It would be her client calling her to congratulate her on a job well done, which meant they had been watching. Were watching. She wasn't sure whether she should be acting cool now or still playing the role of seducer, ensuring Valen was under her spell. He rolled off her, flopped onto his back, and heaved a long sigh. She convinced herself to move, getting onto her front and crawling across the bed. Valen smacked her bare backside. She frowned over her shoulder at him. His smile was unrepentant. She leaned over the side of the bed, fished her jeans from the floor, and found her phone, swiping her thumb across the screen to answer the call as she lifted it to her ear. We need to meet to discuss your next step. The phone went dead. She huffed, sagged into the bed on her front, and let the phone drop to the floor. The soft press of Valen's lips against her bottom pushed the fear that had been trying to creep into her heart back out of it again, drawing all of her focus back to him. He kissed his way up her back, lavishing her tattoo with attention, and over her shoulder, and lay beside her, his back to the window now, something she was grateful for. She didn't like the idea of whoever was watching them getting to see him now that her seduction for their benefit was over, especially if it was Jin. The thought of that bitch seeing Valen naked riled her beyond words. Benares, Valen murmured and idly ran his fingers over her shoulder, his hazy golden eyes following them. She nodded. How did he sound? Ava mulled it over. Pleased, but urgent. He wants me to come to him. Valen stiffened, his fingers pausing against her shoulder. His handsome face darkened. No. While she appreciated his concern, she didn't appreciate his tone. I have to go. If I don't, he will get suspicious. He might decide now would be a good time to kill you. The haze drifted from his eyes again, replaced with calm cold. I said I wouldn't let that happen. And he had meant it, which touched her. I have a theory, a good one, and meeting him might help me turn it from a theory into fact.
I can get more information from him.
She rolled onto her side to face him.
He wants to discuss the next move.
Which might be killing you. His eyes hardened, and she half expected him to flat out refuse to let her go. She was beginning to wish she hadn't told him that Benares planned to kill her now.
I have to do it.
She laid her hand on his cheek, and surprise flitted through her when he didn't knock her hand away, since she had chosen his left one. The skin was rough beneath her fingers, but it was warm. It was him. She smoothed her palm up when he started to look uncomfortable and brushed her fingers through the tangled lengths of his blonde hair.
I want to get all the information I can for you.
A question echoed in his eyes, one that pulled a sigh from her. Yes, she wanted to do it for him. Someone had done a real number on him, worse than the one her family had done on her.
I'll go, get all I can from Benares and Jin, and then I'll meet you.
He shook his head. I'll come with you. Ava twirled a strand of his hair around her finger and wanted to give in and accept that offer, but she couldn't.
What if they're still watching? They've been following both of us. If they see you following me to the villa.
His sigh said it all. Benares would definitely kill her. He caught her hand and drew it away from his hair, and his eyes were sincere when they met hers. Just be careful then. Be quick. In and out. Don't linger. Get the information and get back to me. I'll be waiting at Heavenly Body, keeping my tail occupied. Meet me at 8 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. Ava nodded.
I'll be there.
Her heart melted a little when he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. That same heart went batshit crazy when he disappeared, leaving wisps of black smoke behind. She looked around her apartment, desperate to convince herself that he had just moved faster than her pleasure-hazy brain could comprehend. She was alone. Even his clothes were gone. Ava flopped down onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. She was no longer convinced that she was seeing things. She was now convinced she had gone mad. She must have. She had seen Valen do things that were impossible, including the fact that electricity had definitely sparked from his fingers when he had asked her for a moment, and she had witnessed his brother stop time while the others erased people's memories. And now she had just offered to betray her client, a man who was as dangerous as they came, and liable to kill her if he so much as suspected she was lying to him and was now playing double agent for Valen. Ava corrected herself. She hadn't gone mad. She had lost her fucking mind. Chapter 14. Valen was not sitting in a dark corner of the heaving nightclub, nursing a drink and constantly staring at his phone. He was not counting the seconds, waiting impatiently until the moment he could see Ava again. He wasn't. He tapped the screen, causing it to wake up and illuminate the square steel table and his almost empty drink. The digital clock shifted to 1 minute past 8. Ava was late. He drummed his fingers on the table, trying to keep his temper under control, as 1,000 thoughts assaulted him, tearing him in as many directions, and stirring emotions he struggled to control. White-purple arcs leaped between his fingers, and he grimaced as they forked downwards, striking the table, sending tiny jolts of pain snapping through his bones as they connected. Who the fuck put steel tables in a nightclub anyway? It was the one thing he hated about Heavenly Body. Other than the insane number of possible conductors for his power dotted around the edge of the basement room, it was perfect. A dark, busy space where he could be alone with his thoughts and where demons never bothered him. Hellspawn frequented it, the demons' more noble cousins keeping the wretches at bay. While demons loved to bother him and his brothers because they were guardians of the gates to a place they desperately wanted to go, a barrier between them and the glory of being the first demon to enter the underworld in centuries, they hated Hellspawn and kept their distance from them. They feared them. Valen huffed and flicked the stir in his drink back and forth as he propped his chin up on his upturned palm. They should fear him more than the Hellspawn. He was the one liable to butcher them for just breathing the same damn air as him. His gaze slid to the phone, catching it just before the screen went dark again. 2 minutes past 8. Where was she? A cold feeling settled in his stomach and began to grow, tugging at his feelings, prodding them and pushing them to places he didn't want them to go. She would be here. She was just running late. He glanced at the door, catching glimpses of it through the packed dance floor. She was. One emotion popped free, the one he hated most of all: fear. Another emotion latched onto it and pulled free with it, one that he always succumbed to easily despite his best efforts to let it all roll off his back and not be affected by its poisonous whispers: doubt. What if it had all been an act? She might have been saying everything he wanted to hear, giving him bullshit information so she could get rid of him and make her escape, or worse, so she could do exactly as her client had wanted: seduce him. Had he played right into her hands? If he had, then she was a better actress than he had given her credit for, because he hadn't suspected a thing. He glared at the glass in front of him. He hadn't suspected anything because it had been his idea. Seeing her afraid of the one she had called Benares had sparked a deep protective instinct inside Valen, and that instinct had told him to go along with whatever her client had planned for her to do so she could look as if she was still working for them. He had practically seduced himself for her. He growled and flicked the stirrer so hard that the glass toppled. It cracked when it hit the steel tabletop and rolled towards the edge. He huffed, picked it up, and set it down so fiercely it broke in two. Gods, he was an idiot. Her outburst had convinced him that she gave a fuck about him, that she might feel something for him. Clearly he had been wrong. He should have known better. No one could love him. He checked his phone again. 5 minutes late. Fear that he had been duped morphed into fear something had happened to her, and his heart began to pound in a sickening rhythm against his chest. What if she was only late because Benares had done something to her? He cursed beneath his breath. He should have demanded that he went with her. He shouldn't have let her convince him to stay away. He should have kept pressing his point until she had crumbled, giving in to him. At the very least, he should have made her tell him where the bastard's villa was so he could go there now and check on her. For all he knew, she could be trapped there, held by Benares. She could be hurt. He swallowed hard. Dead. His heart gave a hard beat and he pushed onto his feet, a desperate need to find her flooding him. He didn't care if she had played him, if it had all been an act to her, because it was real to him, and he couldn't bear sitting here doing nothing, not knowing whether she was hurt and afraid, in mortal danger. Movement out of the right corner of his eye sent his eyebrows dipping low. A blonde slinked through the crowd as it parted for her. Her red lips curved in a bright, sultry smile as she flicked glances at all the men who panted after her. Her long hair shimmered beneath the colorful lights, swaying against her backside, almost reaching the hem of her impossibly short black dress. Thigh-high leather boots encased long, toned legs, 4-inch spiked heels making her taller than most of the males around her. Valen stared at her, couldn't take his eyes off her or remember what he had been doing before she had walked into his life. Something pressing, something he needed to remember. It gnawed at him, but he struggled to pin it down, and the longer he looked at the female, the less important it felt. The bartender served her a drink, placing her before all the others who had been waiting at the packed bar for longer. No one seemed to mind. They were all too busy staring at her. She said something, pushed away from the bar, and moved through the club, blue eyes appraising every male, earning her their attention even if they were already with a female. She turned to tease a few of them, giving her back to Valen. He arched an eyebrow at her tiny dress and the fact the damn thing didn't even cover the whole of her backside. Twin curves dipped below the hem of it. If she bent over, she would flash everything at the world. That was no way for a female to dress. A flash of another woman crossed his eyes, the creamy swells of her modest cleavage on show, and heat and hunger surged through him. He looked down at his phone on the table. He had been doing something. The blonde moved closer, facing him again, her pouty lips pursed as she fixed her sultry gaze on him. He had been doing something, hadn't he? He frowned at his phone and shook his head as it grew hazy and he couldn't remember, and then it felt inconsequential again because the female stopped right beside him. She gently placed her drink down on his table and her right hand against his chest. Heat swept through him from the point where she touched, and he frowned down at her hand where it rested against his black t-shirt. This wasn't right. This hand with its black-painted nails and gaudy gold rings wasn't the one he wanted on him. He growled and knocked her hand away, and she gasped, her blue eyes going wide as she staggered back a step and clutched her arm to her ample breasts. Those blue eyes weren't the ones he wanted to lose himself in for eternity. He went to reach for his phone, and she placed her hand on the bare skin of his arm, sending a hot wave through him that fogged his mind and pushed thoughts of leaving out of it. Why had he wanted to leave anyway? Everything he wanted was right here. She leaned towards him, tiptoed to bring her lips to his ear, and whispered,
"Hello, handsome."
A shiver ran through him, and the haziness building in his head thickened, swamping all of his thoughts. She slid her hand up his arm, groaned low in her throat as she traced his taut muscles, and teased the sleeve of his t-shirt.
"You have the body of a god,"
she murmured, and licked his earlobe, sending another hot cascade of tingles through him. "Because I am one," he muttered in response, some part of him aware that he shouldn't have said that he was meant to be doing something else. He was meant to be somewhere else. Her grip on his arm tightened, and the heavy feeling in his limbs increased, pushing those thoughts away again. The only thing that mattered was being here, with her. She feathered her lips along the right side of his jaw, and he closed his eyes, swayed as heat ran through him from the points where her lips pressed and fingers touched. This was where he wanted to be.
"I need a little taste of you,"
she murmured against his skin. He didn't resist her as she pressed her lips to his. He opened for her, lost himself in kissing her. She tasted wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, and the thought only lasted a moment before it dissipated, as if someone had pushed it out of his head. She moaned and slid her arm around his neck, dug her fingers into his hair, and pulled him down for more. Wrong. Her touch was too light, too gentle. Where was the roughness he needed? Where was the wickedness he loved? She nipped at his lip, and for a moment it felt right. But then she kissed him again, and the taste of her flooded his senses, stronger this time. Wrong. Something was wrong. But he couldn't stop kissing her because this was where he wanted to be. She pulled away and breathed against his lips, her voice a throaty murmur of pleasure and approval.
"You have a tongue stud."
A male voice echoed in his head, his own. "Not for the reason you're thinking." A female one joined it, her Italian accent teasing his ears, heating that cold space behind his chest.
"You know that's what they're for, though, right?"
"It's for me, not for you."
"You sure? Because it's about to be for me."
Cold filled his chest again, and he grabbed the woman's shoulders and shoved her back, glared at her as she tried to get close to him again. "Leave me alone." Because he had to be somewhere, wherever the owner of that seductive little voice had gone. Her blue eyes went wide, but the shock in them was short-lived, gone in the space of a heartbeat, and she shoved him into the chair behind him and straddled him. He snarled at her and tried to push her off him, but her mouth descended on his and the haziness rolled back in. He went slack beneath her, lost in the heat of her kiss again, the gnawing feeling in his chest drifting into the distance as the fog built inside him.
"You taste better than I thought you would,"
the blonde murmured against his lips and licked at them.
"I could feast on you for years."
She shook in his arms, moaned as she kissed him again. The haze grew stronger, his body weaker. Feast on him? He sat beneath her, those words echoing in his mind, swimming around it in the strange haze. A different gnawing started inside him. He growled as it broke through the damned fog in his head. "Fucking demon," he snarled against her lips, fisted her blonde hair, and yanked her mouth away from him. She hissed and writhed on his lap, panic filling her blue eyes. He grabbed one of her arms to contain her, but she lashed out with the other, scoring her nails across his neck. He growled and gripped her tighter, tearing a satisfied grunt of pain from her treacherous lips as he pulled her head back so hard he thought her neck might actually snap. She leaned back with it, stopping that from happening, and shoved at him, a wild thing in his arms. A few people stopped to stare. He shot them all black looks that warned them away, and they proved how little backbone they had by leaving and not coming to her aid. Pathetic mortals. The hellspawn merely tossed disinterested looks his way, ones that revealed they had realized a demon walked amongst them, and they weren't going to stand in the way of him killing her. White-purple blazes of lightning crackled around his hands, and she flinched as each tiny bolt leaped to her skin. He sucked down a hard breath and clawed back control, because no matter how fiercely he wanted to blow her apart with his power, he couldn't. His brothers believed he flouted the rules, that he constantly ignored them and did as he pleased without thinking about the consequences. They were wrong. Ava's words rang in his head, a broken replay of her throwing in his face the fact that he had let his brothers come to a wrong conclusion about him and had done nothing to make them see the truth. She was right. He had let them believe the worst of him, and he shouldn't have, because he hadn't flouted the rules. He hadn't acted without considering the consequences. He had done it to further their cause, to aid their mission, and they should have been fucking grateful for it. They should be fucking grateful he wasn't pumping 50,000 volts into the bitch writhing on his lap, too, exposing himself to the watching mortals and inciting the wrath of Zeus and their father. Gods, he wanted to do that, wanted it so badly he hurt, wanted to throw a massive fuck you at his uncle and watch the mortals quake in fear as they recognized him for the powerful being he was, revered him as they should, bowed and scraped at his feet as their ancestors had. But he was better than that. Or at least he wanted to be. So as much as it sickened him, the bitch got to live, and the mortals got to carry on oblivious to the fact they were in the presence of a god. He released her arm, grabbed the broken glass from the table, and had it pressed against her throat before she could even move. She froze, terror lighting her eyes as she tried to look down at the glass where it hovered close to her artery. Demons died just as easily as mortals.
"Hurt me and you'll never see Ava again," she said, and he was the one who froze this time. His blood ran cold.
"Where is she?" The woman smiled wickedly.
"With my darling brother. And right about now, she's probably falling into his arms and under his spell."
Chapter 15. Coming to the mansion alone hadn't been a wise idea. Ava stood opposite Benares in the sumptuous living room, a place she had never been before and one she never wanted to set foot in again. There was only one exit, and that was the door beyond the couch where he sat. Clever bastard. By being already seated on the gaudy antique sofa when she had arrived, he had skillfully forced her into having to move to the furthest point from the door in order to see him. He had maneuvered her into a position where she was at a disadvantage. Benares gestured to the couch opposite the monstrosity he lounged on, wearing only his shoes and black slacks, his bare torso on full display. The second sofa was equally as hideous, with dull gold fabric stretched over the solid seat and back, and bright gold on the wooden decorative edges and the claw-footed legs. Ava shook her head. Again. His handsome face darkened at her refusal. He sighed dramatically and preened his blonde locks. The action caused his biceps to tense beneath his sun-kissed skin, and the muscles of his torso tightened with them, shifting in a symphony that drew her gaze down to them. A trickle of heat ran through her. She forced her eyes back up to his stunning green ones. The smile that teased his blush-full lips grated on her nerves for some reason. She frowned, wiping that smile away.
"Signor Benares, I have done what you wanted. My contract is fulfilled."
She hadn't meant that to come out as a question, spoken with a waver in her voice that he heard, judging by the way his smile returned. He liked that he made her nervous. It hadn't been the case before she had come into contact with Valen. Damn him. He made her weak. She had allowed herself to feel something for him, and now it was working against her. In him, she had found a reason to live, and that had allowed a fear of dying to creep into her heart. Now she couldn't look at Benares without feeling as if she was looking death in the face. Benares casually crossed his legs at his ankles where they rested on the also rather hideous golden glass coffee table, between the couch he sat on and the one she stood beside. He stretched, every muscle on his honed, powerful body shifting in response, luring her gaze back down to it. Another tremor of heat rippled through her. Ava shook it away, but it was harder this time. She rubbed her forehead as it ached. He placed both of his hands behind his head and frowned at her, concern in his green eyes. "Are you unwell, my angel?" She shook her head, mostly because she hated it when he called her that, partly because the ache grew stronger as he spoke, his British accent filling her ears.
"It's been a long day,"
she murmured, closed her eyes, and drew down a deep breath. The heavy feeling in her head faded a little, but it came back when she looked across at Benares. He smiled at her, something about it setting her on edge, even though he didn't look any different to how he normally appeared. His green eyes shimmered with warmth, heat that always made her want to leave, to get away from him even as she wanted to get closer. "Apparently so," he said in a low voice laced with a warm, teasing edge that curled around her. He ran his green eyes over her, lingering on her breasts and her hips, and then lifted them to meet hers. "You had quite the workout." She frowned at him again.
"I did what you wanted. I'm done."
Her stomach dropped when he shook his head. Her blood ran cold. This was exactly what she had expected, but she hadn't anticipated the jolt of fear that had run through her on having him confirm that he wanted her to do something else. He wanted more from her. She was beginning to fear what that more was. She was beginning to wish that bitch was present, because being alone with him set her on edge, and she couldn't stop her eyes from leaping between him and the door, betraying her nerves. "You seem tense," he husked, and a hot shiver ran through her, melting some of that tension from her muscles. He sighed and shook his head. "He obviously did not do a very good job. If it had been me in that position, between your thighs, you would have been boneless, my angel. Sated for days." She schooled her features as fear flooded her and resisted the urge to look at the door again, desperately trying to keep her feelings hidden from him. Something was wrong. Off. This wasn't right. He was different. Usually he flirted with her, but tonight there was an edge to it, a darkness about him that rang alarm bells in her head. Was he angry with her? Or with Valen? Was he jealous? She had seen what jealousy did to men. She had witnessed how it drove the weaker ones to do terrible things, to take out their anger on the one they felt had betrayed them and hurt them, believing the object of their desire would only want to be with them then. Her own father had been such a man, abusive, vicious, jealous of every man who had so much as looked at her beautiful mother. Her mother had been loyal to him, had defended him whenever he had hurt her, had loved him despite his terrible flaws, and because she hadn't stood up for herself, her brother had walked in their father's footsteps, believing it was all right to behave that way, to treat women as if they were objects, possessions, slaves. Anger flashed through her, heating her blood to boiling, and she clenched her fists as memories assaulted her, images of all the times her father had hurt her mother, of all the times her mother had made excuses for his behavior, and of all the times her father had betrayed her trust. How many women had been his mistress in the years he had proclaimed to love her mother, in the years he had told her how faithful and loyal he was being to her, despite how disloyal and unfaithful she was to him by allowing men to just look at her. Her mother had been a fool, but she hadn't deserved any of it. She hadn't deserved to be used, hollowed out of all her feelings and slowly destroyed, simply because she had loved someone, and they had only pretended to return that love. No one deserved that. "My angel?" Benares whispered into her ear, and she tensed. His hands came down on her shoulders, warming her leather jacket, and she went rigid as he closed his fingers over her, the pressure of his grip sending a cold tremor through her. Dangerous. She shouldn't have lost awareness of her surroundings like that, allowing him to move without her knowing it. Damn it. But she might be able to work it to her advantage. He had left the couch and now stood behind her, which meant the path to the door was clear. She shirked his grip and turned on him, backed off a step and placed some distance between them, placing her closer to the exit. He frowned at her, his green eyes darkening, and then smiled. "Are you sure you are not unwell?" She nodded, brushed her short black hair out of her face, and laughed it off. "I'm just tired. Are we done?" No, he said, no trace of feeling in his deep voice, and sighed as he looked her over. You should take more care of yourself. It would not do for such a beautiful flower to be allowed to wilt. Wilt? Ava arched an eyebrow at him and glanced off to her left, to the object in the room that disturbed her most, an entire wall of mirrors. She had been sure Benares was vain the moment she had met him, but this mirror went beyond vanity, and it wasn't there for the sake of making the massive room appear larger. Ice crept down her spine. It was there for other reasons. Reasons she didn't want to think about, and that kept her firmly on edge around him, aware that she was in a dangerous position. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, his voice ringing in her ears. She hadn't bothered to fix her makeup after showering or dry and style her hair. She had wanted the meeting over with as quickly as possible so she could get back to Valen with the information she had promised.
It's been a long day,
she said with a false smile and turned back to Benares.
Sometimes a woman needs a day off.
He shrugged, bare shoulders rolling in a way that made his pecs dance and remind her that he was only half dressed. It is no problem. You are still beautiful, perhaps even more so without the trappings of human nature. I think I almost prefer you in your raw, natural state. Another shudder went down her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She glanced over her shoulder at the door. When she looked back at Benares, he had moved closer to her. Is something wrong? He murmured, concern in his eyes that she wanted to believe was real, even when she felt certain it was all an act, designed to set her at ease around him and make her enamored with him.
I'm just waiting for that woman to show up.
Woman? He frowned down at her, and then at the wooden door, and then it melted away and he smiled, charming to the last. My sister. She will not be back tonight. Ava's stomach turned. Jin hadn't been lying. They were siblings. She swallowed the bile that rose in her throat and barely resisted clutching her stomach as it churned. The way they acted around each other had led her to believe they were lovers, and now they were brother and sister. She wanted to be sick. Benares pressed his palm to her forehead and she tensed. When the hell had he moved closer? She had to stop spacing out around him or she was going to end up in trouble. She brushed his hand away and paced the room, her boots loud on the wooden floor that had been polished so highly that it reflected the grotesque golden furniture and red walls. You are unwell, Benares said, and she didn't bother to deny it this time, because it would be a good excuse for her vomiting all over his expensive Italian leather shoes.
I think I picked up a cold in the rain,
she muttered, hoping it would be enough to get him off her case. Perhaps you have been putting things in your mouth that do not belong there, and that has made you sick. What the hell was that supposed to mean? She turned to ask him whether he was making insinuations about the things she had done with Valen, and whether Jin had been giving him a blow-by-blow record of events over the phone, and then thought better of it. He stood at the opposite side of the room, his arms folded across his bare chest and his handsome face set in a black scowl. Jealousy. Her father had looked like that too often, on the verge of losing his temper, fighting the need to lash out. She didn't want to be on the receiving end of Benares's anger. The darkness lifted from his eyes and his face softened as he crossed the room to her. I am not myself today. I apologize. She didn't stop him when he raised his hand, smoothed his palm across her cheek, and tilted her head back, lifting her eyes to meet his, because rejecting him would be the push he needed to shove him over the edge. Instead, she allowed the caress, allowed him to be this close to her when all she wanted to do was push him away, and she hated herself for it. She was just like her mother. Ava broke away from him, unable to bear it after all. She was stronger than that. She would never allow anyone to use her that way, to lead her on and use her feelings against her. She wouldn't let someone play her for a fool.
What is it you want me to do now?
She zipped her leather up, trying to make it clear that they were done and she was going to leave. Benares stood just a few inches from her, his green gaze locked on her face, a myriad of emotions playing across his eyes, one she wanted to decipher because she feared they were all about her. His pupils dilated and his eyes dropped to her lips, and her heart started a slow pound against her chest. That wasn't what she had meant by her question.
Am I to seduce the mark again?
She kept her tone level, voice empty of emotion, and schooled her features again to hide all of her feelings from Benares. All business.
Or do you want me to kill him?
His eyes snapped up to hers. Kill him? Darkness crossed his features. As much as I would like it, that is not part of the plan. He curled his hands into fists at his side, and she had the feeling he really did want to kill Valen, and he was angry that he couldn't order his death. Why couldn't he?
So what is the plan?
She said, more curious than ever. Keep him under your spell. There was bite in his tone, anger that she had never heard before, and it compounded the feeling that he wanted Valen dead, but it wasn't allowed, that they needed him alive for some reason, and it was killing Benares. Bring him to the villa. You have 3 days. So he wanted Valen alive and unharmed, but under her spell, and she had 3 days to deliver him. Her curiosity grew, and she wanted to voice the questions filling her mind, but held her tongue and kept her cool. Her heart provided the answer to the question plaguing her the most. Had this been the plan from the start? Yes. Benares had said the drug was a means to an end when she had questioned him. He hadn't meant that it would kill Valen. He had meant that it was the only way to get what he wanted. He knew more about Valen than she had thought. He had known that she wouldn't be able to deliver the drug to Valen because he was too strong and far quicker than she was, and that she would end up exposed to it instead, and that Valen wouldn't be able to resist her when that happened. He had known that Valen would sleep with her, and that it would affect him, that she would become a weakness he could exploit. They didn't want Valen dead. They wanted him vulnerable. Why? The answer hit her hard. Benares didn't only know about Valen. He knew about Valen's brothers, too. He knew about the crazy shit that surrounded them and that they were different. He knew everything, including the fact that Valen already felt like an outcast. She had realized Valen felt that way when she had witnessed how his brothers had treated him and how he had reacted when she had confronted him about it. He believed they couldn't love him, that they hated him. Valen was already vulnerable. Benares was merely using that to his advantage, employing her as a weapon against him, one designed to turn Valen to his side. She was going to be the instrument of his downfall. A cold shiver chased through her, and she wanted to tell Benares the deal was off, to scream at him that what he was doing was cruel and vicious, and she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't hurt Valen by using his feelings against him. Benares watched her like a hawk. Ava pulled herself together and steadied her racing heart. She wasn't going to hurt Valen because she wasn't going to do what Benares wanted. He didn't need to know that, though. She needed to keep up the act and keep her shit together, or Benares was going to see straight through her and see that she was playing him. And then he would kill her.
I'll do it in 2.
She flipped her hair out of her face and shot him a smile. 3 will suffice. He closed in on her again. My sister will be well fed by then. Fed? She must have looked confused because he smiled. Calmly said, You do not want to know. She didn't, but he obviously wanted to tell her, and that meant whatever he was talking about would frighten her.
3 days it is, then.
She turned towards the door and gasped when she found him standing right in front of her, blocking her exit. What the hell? He advanced on her, and against her better instincts, she backed away, moving further into the room, towards the wall of mirrors she felt sure served an erotic purpose. I'm a little hungry myself. He raked green eyes over her, from head to toe and back again, and strange heat bloomed in the wake of his gaze, but quickly turned to cold as it moved on, lifting towards her face. You seemed pleased earlier, when I said Jin was out. She hadn't been pleased, wasn't sure where he had gotten that one from. She had been trying to stop herself from throwing up. He closed the distance between them and towered over her. Is it my sister's absence that pleases you, or being alone with me? His mouth was on hers before she could respond, fierce and hot, forcing her to open to him. She pressed her hands to his bare chest, and he wrapped his arms around her tightly, pinning her against him. His tongue invaded her mouth. Ava bit down on it. He growled and reared back, and she shoved at his chest, struggling against him and trying to break free as her heart thundered, fear-sending adrenaline coursing through her veins. Fight won this time. She brought her knee up hard between his legs. He grunted and released her. She staggered backwards, legs trembling and pulse racing, battling for control over her body and her mind. Escape. She had to escape. She edged sideways toward the two couches and the door. Benares breathed hard, doubled over and clutching himself as he muttered dark-sounding things in a language she didn't know. She eyed the door again, and then him as she finally gained control of her fear, and fury rushed in to fill the void it left inside her. Her memories pummeled her, battering her from all sides, disjointed snippets of how her father had treated her mother. Ava wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, revulsion sweeping through her on the heels of her anger.
You kiss me with the same mouth you kiss your sister with?
Not the same mouth, Benares muttered and slowly lifted his head. A cold wind blasted through her, chilling her so fiercely her feet froze to the wooden floor and she couldn't breathe. Couldn't believe what she was seeing. Bright white embers glowed in his eyes, his pupils nothing more than thin vertical slits in the centers of his irises, and the skin around them turned dark and then cracked, forming jagged fissures that shone bright blue. He rose to his full height and seemed to grow even taller as he straightened. Blue markings like lightning streaked over his shoulders and down his arms, caressed his sides and glowed as fiercely as the ones around his eyes. Around those markings, his skin darkened to the color of ash. The tips of his ears stretched into points, and his hair blackened at the roots and bled into crimson at the ends. His lips flattened, darkened to obsidian, and sharp teeth flashed between them as he spoke. "This is the mouth I kiss my sister with." Ava screamed and kicked off, breaking left towards the door. Benares grabbed her right arm and she shrieked as he pulled it so hard the socket blazed and pain near blinded her, making her vision wink in and out of the darkness. He whirled her to face him and she clawed at him as he kissed her, lips fiery hot on her neck. Heat swept through her, carrying away her will to fight as it invaded her flesh and then her bones, sinking deep into her. She wanted this. She wanted him. No, she didn't want this. She didn't want him. He was a monster. Ava gathered herself and shoved against him, slapping at his face and his shoulders, and he growled into her neck and held her closer, pressing claws into her sides. "Get off me!" She shoved with all of her might, slamming her palm into his jaw and knocking his head back and his lips away from her. "You disgust me!" She hit him again and managed to break free this time, but she didn't get far. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back to him, and her eyes went wide as his lips came down on hers. Heat flowed through her, driving out the fear and the fury, replacing it with strange calm. She surrendered to it, losing herself. But then a thought pinged into her head. It wasn't right. This wasn't the man she wanted to kiss. "Get your damn hands off me!" She wrapped her hand around his throat and squeezed as hard as she could. Benares snarled, the sound dark and unholy. "You will give in to me." "Never!" She stamped on his foot and shoved with her hand, pushing him off her again. She threw a hard right hook, slamming it into his nose. He grunted, staggered back, and pressed his hand to his face. His eyes darkened when it came away covered in black liquid. The white sparks in them grew brighter. He turned them on her. She saw the instant his temper snapped. Ava made another break for it. Benares appeared in front of her, his fist connected hard with her jaw, and she went down fast. Pain bloomed on the left side of her head as it struck the edge of the couch. The last thing she saw was Benares standing over her, violence and hunger in his glowing eyes. And then everything went black.